My name is Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old. I am not a victim. I am a survivor of the ultimate family betrayal. For 40 years, I built a massive cold chain supply and logistics empire right here in Chicago. I started with one used refrigerated truck and a pair of frostbitten hands. I turned it into a company worth tens of millions. I did it all for my family. I did it for my son, Derek. But this story is not about my financial success. It is about the moment I stood in the hallway of my own home holding my breath, listening to the two people I trusted most in this world plot my absolute destruction. It was supposed to be a gift, a luxury world cruise to help me grieve the passing of my beautiful wife, Martha. That is what my son told me. But as I stood outside my own kitchen, hidden in the shadows, I heard my daughter-in-law, Natalie, laughing. I heard my own flesh and blood, the boy whose Ivy League tuition I paid in cash, make a cold, calculated toast. They were drinking my vintage champagne, celebrating the fact that the cruise ticket they bought me was a one-way trip. Once the freighter docked in Nassau, I was going to be quietly collected by orderlies and permanently locked away in a corrupt offshore asylum. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their lives piece by piece, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that true karma comes to those who betray their own blood. I want you to know, right now, I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not storm into that kitchen and demand answers. Tears are for the weak. Instead, I walked out the back door, got into my car, and used my 40 years of ruthless corporate experience to orchestrate a revenge so cold, so methodical, they never even saw the blade until it was already turning. Let me take you back to the beginning of the end. It was a crisp, biting Tuesday morning in late November. The kind of Chicago morning where the wind off Lake Michigan cuts right through your coat and chills you to the bone. I was sitting in the leather armchair of my study, staring blankly at the unlit fireplace. It had been exactly 1 year since my wife Martha passed away. 42 years of marriage gone in the blink of an eye. The house, a sprawling suburban estate in Winnetka that used to be filled with her warmth, her laughter, and the smell of her baking, felt like a silent, empty museum. I was a ghost haunting my own life. I was working 80-hour weeks just to avoid the deafening silence of those empty rooms. My hands, still rough and calloused from those early years hauling frozen beef across state lines in the dead of winter, felt entirely empty without hers to hold. The heavy oak front door chimed, pulling me abruptly out of my heavy thoughts. It was Derek, my son. He walked into the foyer, brushing the light snow off the shoulders of his tailored Italian wool overcoat. Right behind him was Natalie, his wife, carrying a silver tray of pastries from that incredibly expensive bakery downtown. They looked like the absolute perfect picture of modern success. I felt a profound surge of pride just looking at him. I remembered working 36-hour shifts, sleeping in the cramped cab of my truck at truck stops in Ohio, breathing in diesel fumes, just so Derek would never have to know what bone-deep exhaustion actually felt like. I built the logistics empire so he could wear those expensive coats and walk into high-rise boardroom meetings with absolute confidence. Dad, Derek said, his voice soft, almost fragile. "We need to talk to you. It is really important." He guided me gently to the dining room table. Natalie poured me a cup of black coffee, her hand resting warmly on my shoulder. It was a gesture of profound comfort, or so I thought at the time. Derek sat directly across from me, his face a perfect, flawless mask of deep concern. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick, luxurious ivory envelope. He slid it slowly across the polished mahogany table toward me. I looked at the envelope, then back up at him. "What is this, Derek?" "Open it," he urged, leaning forward, his eyes shining with what looked exactly like unshed tears. I broke the gold wax seal. Inside was a thick booklet of premium travel documents, first-class boarding passes, VIP itineraries. It was a fully paid ticket for a 3-month ultra-luxury world cruise. The ports of call were incredible. The Mediterranean, the Caribbean, the Bahamas. It was the exact trip Martha and I had dreamed of taking when I finally decided to retire. Derek reached across the table and covered my rough, aged hand with his soft, perfectly manicured one. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "you have been running the logistics company for 40 years. You have given us absolutely everything. But since Mom passed, we have been watching you fade away. You are working yourself into an early grave. You are carrying this massive burden of grief, and you are doing it all alone. You deserve to heal." I stared down at the ticket. The sheer cost of it must have been staggering. But it was not the money that caught my throat and made my eyes burn. It was the sentiment. "I cannot just leave the company for 3 months, Derek," I argued, though my voice completely lacked its usual booming authority. "The winter supply chain is an absolute nightmare. The union contracts are up for renegotiation in January. I need to be there." "Dad, stop!" Derek interrupted, squeezing my hand tighter. "I have been your vice president for 5 years. The executive team is completely solid. I can handle the company. I know the shipping routes. I know the major clients. It is time for you to let go of the wheel for a little while. You built a machine that runs itself. Let me do my job so you can go find some peace. Mom would have wanted you to see the world not die behind a mahogany desk." Natalie chimed in, her voice dripping with absolute sweetness. "We just want you to be happy, Richard. You have been a ghost lately. This trip has world-class medical staff, gourmet chefs, and specialized grief counseling right on board. It is exactly what you need to breathe again." I looked down at my hands. They were trembling slightly. For a brief, foolish moment, I let myself fully believe them. I let myself believe that I had raised a son capable of profound empathy and love. I thought about the bitter cold out on the trucking routes, the years I spent fighting tooth and nail against rival fleets to build Caldwell Logistics from the ground up. I was tired. So deeply, profoundly tired in my very soul. The thought of feeling the warm Caribbean sun on my face, of sitting on a private deck overlooking the endless ocean, and finally letting myself cry for Martha felt like a rescue line being thrown to a drowning man. I looked up at my son. The boy I would have gladly taken a bullet for. The boy I gave the entire world to. "Thank you, Derek," I whispered, my voice thick with real, raw emotion. I stood up and pulled him into a tight embrace. I felt his arms wrap securely around me, patting my back. It felt like love. It felt like safety. I had absolutely no idea I was hugging a venomous snake. "We will handle everything with the house, Dad," Natalie said, smiling brightly as she began gathering the empty coffee cups. "We will pack your bags. We will arrange the private car to the port. All you have to do is rest and prepare yourself." Over the next 2 weeks, they orchestrated my departure with terrifying, flawless efficiency. They took my best suits to the dry cleaners. They packed my vintage steamer trunks. Derek even casually brought over a thick stack of legal documents for me to sign. Just routine stuff, he had said casually, standing in my study while I was distracted, trying to find my reading glasses. End-of-year tax extensions, a temporary corporate power of attorney, just in case an emergency vendor contract needs signing while you are out in international charters. I trusted him implicitly. Why would I not? He was my blood. I signed the papers, blindly eager to get back to sorting through Martha's old photograph albums. I did not read the fine print. I did not notice that the bank accounts had begun to lock me out of the digital portals. I just assumed it was a glitch with the new security software the IT department had installed. I was so utterly blinded by my own grief and by the comforting illusion of their love that I willingly walked right into the slaughterhouse. I spent my final night in the house, sitting alone in Martha's garden, wrapped in a heavy blanket, looking up at the gray Chicago sky. I told her I was going on our trip. I told her I was finally going to rest. I felt a sense of quiet peace that I had not felt in 12 long months. I went to bed that night feeling incredibly blessed. I truly thought I was the luckiest father in the world to have a son who cared so deeply about my mental well-being. But the truth was waiting for me the very next morning. The truth is never a gentle thing. It does not knock politely. It kicks down the door and burns your life to the ground. And the next morning, as the black luxury car idled in my driveway, waiting to take me away forever, the match was finally lit. The heavy snow had started falling again, just as the sleek black Lincoln Navigator pulled into the circular driveway. The driver, a polite young man in a dark suit, loaded my heavy vintage steamer trunks into the back with a quiet efficiency. I stood on the front porch for a moment, pulling my wool collar up against the biting wind, and looked back at the grand stone facade of the house. It looked peaceful. I genuinely believed I was leaving it in good hands. I climbed into the warm leather back seat, settling in for the long drive to the port. The engine hummed quietly. I reached instinctively into the right pocket of my overcoat, expecting to feel the familiar comforting weight of the small object I carried everywhere. It was Martha's antique silver pillbox. She had bought it at a tiny flea market in Paris on our 10th anniversary. After she passed, I started keeping it in my pocket, running my thumb over the intricate floral engravings whenever I needed to feel close to her. My fingers met nothing but the smooth silk lining of the pocket. My heart did a sudden, uncomfortable leap. I checked the other pocket. Empty. I realized instantly where I had left it. It was sitting on the mahogany nightstand in the master bedroom right next to the lamp I had turned off just 20 minutes ago. I could not leave without it. It was my anchor to the woman I loved. I leaned forward and tapped the glass partition. "Give me just one moment," I told the driver. "I left something essential inside. I will be right back." I stepped out of the warm luxury vehicle and walked back into the freezing morning air. I decided not to use the heavy front doors. They had a tendency to stick and groan loudly in the winter, and I did not want to drag snow across the pristine marble foyer that the housekeeper had just polished. Instead, I walked around the side of the house following the stone path that led to the garden entrance. The frosted glass door opened silently with my key. I stepped into the warm, dim mudroom, unbuttoning my coat so I could move quietly. The house felt incredibly still. I walked softly down the long, hardwood hallway toward the main staircase. As I passed the grand archway leading to the kitchen, a sharp, sudden noise shattered the silence. It was the distinct festive pop of a champagne cork. It echoed loudly against the custom tile and granite countertops. I froze in my tracks. It was barely 8 in the morning. I naturally assumed it was just Derek and Natalie sharing a quiet, perhaps slightly premature toast to their new responsibilities. I even smiled to myself, thinking it was a harmless celebration of a young couple finally getting the house to themselves. I took a step closer to the archway, intending to peek in and say a quick goodbye again. But before I could turn the corner, I heard Natalie speak. Her voice was not sweet. It was not gentle. It was dripping with a toxic, exhausted relief. "God, finally," she sighed, the sound of liquid pouring smoothly into crystal flutes following her words. "I thought I was going to lose my mind if I had to smell that awful stale old man scent for one more day. The house literally reeks of his depressing grief. We are going to need to hire a professional cleaning crew just to fumigate the West Wing." I stopped breathing. The smile instantly died on my face. My hand gripped the edge of the hallway wall so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Then Derek spoke. My son. The boy I had spent 40 years sacrificing my life to protect. His voice was casual light and utterly devoid of any human empathy. "Relax, Natalie," he chuckled. "It is done. He is in the car. By the time he figures it out, it will be far too late." I leaned closer to the wall, my heart hammering a violent rhythm against my ribs. Figures what out, I thought frantically. What was there to figure out? "Drink up, my beautiful wife," Derek continued, the clinking of their glasses ringing out like a death knell in the quiet house. "To Caldwell Logistics and to our new absolute freedom. That ticket he is holding is strictly one way." I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. What did he mean one way? It was a 3-month world cruise. I had seen the itinerary. I had held the glossy brochures in my own hands. But Derek was not finished. He took a sip of champagne and let out a deeply satisfied breath. "The captain of the freighter has been paid generously to ignore him completely," Derek said smoothly. "And once that rusted tub docks in Nassau, he will not be stepping off onto a sunny beach. The orderlies from the St. Jude Psychiatric Facility are already scheduled to meet the ship at the cargo pier. They specialize in patients with severe, unmanageable dementia. They will collect him, sedate him, and lock him away in a secure ward where the American legal system cannot reach him. He will never set foot in the United States again." I stood in the shadows of the hallway, entirely paralyzed. The air in my lungs felt like shattered glass. My own son had just casually detailed his plan to traffic me to a corrupt offshore asylum. It was not a luxury cruise liner waiting for me at the port. It was a cargo freighter, a floating prison. He was sending me to a place where people are sent to quietly disappear. I closed my eyes, fighting off a sudden wave of dizzying nausea. In that terrifying silent moment, the fog of my grief instantly evaporated. My mind, trained by decades of ruthless corporate warfare, suddenly snapped into a state of hyper-clarity. The puzzle pieces of the last 3 weeks began slamming into place with sickening precision. The tax extension documents he had rushed me to sign while I was looking for my reading glasses. They were never tax forms. They were legal traps. The sudden banking glitches that locked me out of the digital portals. It was not an IT error. He had systematically stripped my access. He had severed my financial lifelines. He was not taking over the company to help me heal. He had stolen my empire, stolen my home, and now he was permanently disposing of my body. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was beyond anything I had ever faced in the most cutthroat boardrooms in the world. This was my flesh and blood. This was the child I had taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway just outside that very kitchen window. A weaker man would have charged into that kitchen. A more emotional father would have screamed, overturned, the table demanded answers and wept at their feet. But I was Richard Caldwell. I did not build an empire by acting on blind rage. Confronting them now would be completely useless. If Derek had the legal documents in place, if he had truly orchestrated this trap, showing my hand would only give him the opportunity to call the authorities and execute his plan right here in Chicago. I had to be smarter. I had to be completely invisible. I took a slow, silent step backward away from the kitchen. I did not make a single sound. I left the antique silver pillbox upstairs. It no longer mattered. I turned and walked back through the dim mudroom, slipping out the frosted glass door into the freezing wind. I locked it quietly behind me. The cold air hit my face, shocking my system, hardening my resolve into pure steel. I walked back down the stone path toward the idling black navigator. My posture was straight. My face was an unreadable mask. I opened the door and climbed back into the leather seat. "Did you find what you were looking for, sir?" the young driver asked politely, looking at me through the rearview mirror. "No," I replied, my voice perfectly calm, smooth, and dead. "But I found exactly what I needed. You can go ahead and take us away." The driver nodded and pulled the heavy vehicle out of the driveway. I looked out the tinted window at my house as it faded into the distance. The war had just begun, and they had absolutely no idea they were already fighting a ghost. The ride toward the interstate was thick with a suffocating silence. I sat in the back of the spacious luxury SUV, watching the snow-covered suburban streets of Winnetka roll by through the tinted glass. Every turn of the wheels was supposed to be taking me closer to a luxurious ocean liner, to the sunny decks of a world cruise designed to heal my broken heart. Instead, every passing mile was carrying me closer to my own living funeral. I focused on my breathing, in and out, slow and measured. I had to force the father inside of me to die right there in the back seat of that hired car. The man who loved Derek, the man who remembered a little boy with scraped knees running through the yard, had to be completely buried. In his place, the founder of Caldwell Logistics had to resurrect. The ruthless, calculating businessman who had crushed rival supply chains and navigated the brutal mob-controlled shipping routes of 1980s Chicago had to take the wheel. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the thick ivory envelope containing my ticket. I stared at the elegant gold foil lettering on the front. It was a masterpiece of deception. We were approaching the main highway entrance, about 20 miles out from the designated port. I leaned forward and gently tapped the glass partition, dividing me from the driver. "Pull off at the next exit," I said, my voice projecting an absolute, unquestionable authority. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, clearly confused. "Sir, the port is straight ahead," he replied cautiously. "If we pull off now, we might hit industrial traffic and delay your boarding schedule." I pulled my thick leather wallet from my inner pocket. "Take the exit, son," I repeated evenly. I pulled out 10 crisp $100 bills and slipped them through the small opening in the partition. The young man looked at the money, his eyes widening slightly. "There is a small rundown diner just past the overpass on Elm Street," I instructed. "Pull in there. Unload my trunks by the side door. Then you are going to take this money, drive back to the city, and take the rest of the week off. If my son or his wife calls to check on my arrival at the port, you will tell them you dropped me off exactly on time and watched me walk through the terminal doors. Do you understand me?" The driver swallowed hard, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He was young, probably working 2 jobs to pay off student loans, and $1,000 in untraceable cash was more than enough to buy his silence. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, sliding the bills into his coat pocket. He engaged the turn signal and guided the heavy vehicle off the highway, moving into the bleak gray industrial outskirts of the city. The diner was exactly as I remembered it from my early trucking days. Faded neon signs, cracked asphalt in the parking lot, and the heavy smell of old frying oil hanging in the freezing air. It was a place where ghosts stopped for coffee. The driver parked near the back alley, quickly unloaded my heavy vintage steamer trunks, and set them carefully by the rear entrance. He gave me one last uncertain nod before climbing back into the driver's seat and pulling away. I stood alone in the freezing cold, surrounded by my luggage completely severed from my old life. My first move was not into the diner, but across the street to a dingy convenience store. I walked down the narrow aisles smelling cheap detergent and stale tobacco, and purchased a prepaid untraceable cell phone with cash. I also bought a simple black canvas duffel bag. I walked back across the street and dragged my trunks into the alleyway behind the diner. I opened the expensive vintage cases and quickly transferred only my most essential clothing, my medications, and a small stack of cash I always kept hidden in the lining into the cheap black duffel bag. I left the expensive monogrammed trunks sitting right there by the dumpsters. They belonged to a man who no longer existed. I slung the duffel bag over my shoulder and walked into the diner. The bell above the door jingled weakly. The place was mostly empty, just a few tired mechanics hunched over plates of eggs. I took a booth in the far back corner facing the door. A waitress with weary eyes brought me a mug of black coffee. I did not touch it. I opened the cheap plastic packaging of the burner phone, powered it on, and stared at the glowing digital keypad. I needed information, and I needed it from someone entirely outside of Derek's sphere of influence. I could not call corporate security. I could not call the local police. If Derek had already established legal guardianship through those fraudulent tax documents, the police would simply detain me and hand me right back to him, under the guise of elder protection. I needed someone who operated comfortably in the shadows. I closed my eyes and dug deep into my memory, retrieving a phone number I had not dialed in over 15 years. Victor Rossi. In the late 80s and early 90s, when Caldwell Logistics was expanding rapidly, we faced vicious opposition from deeply entrenched corrupt transport unions and rival freight companies. Trucks were being sabotaged. Drivers were being intimidated. I needed someone who could fight in the mud. Victor was a private investigator who specialized in corporate espionage, leverage acquisition, and making very loud problems quietly disappear. He was a ruthless, morally flexible man, but he possessed a rigid code of loyalty to whoever signed his checks. I dialed the 11 digits. The line rang 4 times before a gravelly, sleep-heavy voice answered. "Yeah," the voice grunted. "Victor," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "It is Richard Caldwell." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I heard the rustle of sheets and the scratching of a match being struck to light a cigarette. "Well, I will be damned." Victor chuckled softly, exhaling a thick cloud of smoke I could almost smell through the receiver. "The Ice King of Chicago. I heard you retired to count your millions and prune roses, Richard. To what do I owe the pleasure of a call from the crypt?" "I do not have time for pleasantries, Victor," I replied. "I am off the grid. I am using a burner phone, and I am currently sitting in a diner with nothing but a duffel bag. I need your services immediately, and this entire operation must remain completely off the books." The amusement instantly vanished from Victor's voice, replaced by the sharp, focused edge of a predator catching a scent. "Give it to me," he said simply. I pulled the ivory envelope from my coat, opened the glossy brochure, and read off the long alphanumeric booking confirmation number printed at the bottom of the ticket. "I need you to run this booking number," I instructed. "My son just handed it to me. He claims it is a 3-month luxury world cruise departing from the municipal port today. But he is lying. I overheard him saying it is a one-way trip on a cargo freighter bound for a place called the St. Jude facility in Nassau. I need you to find out exactly what this ship is, who owns it, and what waits for me at the end of the line." "Give me 20 minutes, Victor said, and the line went dead. I sat in the diner for exactly 24 minutes. The coffee in front of me grew ice cold. Outside the frosted window, the Chicago snow continued to fall, burying the city under a thick, indifferent blanket of white. I thought about Natalie complaining about my smell. I thought about Derek raising a glass of my own champagne to celebrate my permanent exile. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it fueled the furnace burning in my chest. Finally, the cheap plastic phone vibrated against the table. I picked it up immediately. "Richard," Victor said. His voice was grim, stripped of all its usual cynical armor. "I just hacked into the Maritime Port Registry using a back door I keep open for customs investigations. The ticket you are holding is a masterpiece of forged logistics. It traces back to a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. There is no luxury liner scheduled to depart today. Your ticket corresponds to a vessel called the Mariner's Repose." "What is it?" I asked quietly. "It is a rusted-out, decommissioned container freighter," Victor explained. "It runs off the books, transporting undocumented cargo through the Caribbean. The captain has a rap sheet longer than my arm for human trafficking and smuggling. The passenger manifest does not even list your name. You are registered on the cargo manifest as medical freight." I closed my eyes. Medical freight. And the destination, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Victor took a heavy breath. "The St. Jude Medical Institute in Nassau. Richard, this place is a black site for the ultra-wealthy. It is not a hospital. It is a disposal facility. They specialize in receiving elderly, problematic family members who control large fortunes or trust funds. The local Bahamian authorities are entirely bought and paid for. Once a patient is signed over to St. Jude, they are immediately stripped of all identification, heavily sedated with chemical restraints, and locked in a secure ward. Because the Bahamas has incredibly complicated extradition treaties regarding medical guardianship once you cross their threshold, American lawyers cannot touch you. Your son was not just sending you on a bad vacation, Richard. He was sending you to a pharmaceutical prison where you would slowly lose your mind from the drugs, completely forgotten by the outside world, until you quietly passed away in your sleep. The reality of Derek's plan settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. He had thought of everything. The forged medical power of attorney would explain my sudden departure to any inquisitive friends or board members. The offshore jurisdiction would block any legal rescue attempts. He had built a perfect, inescapable coffin, and he had wrapped it in a beautiful ivory envelope. "Are you still there, Richard?" Victor asked, his voice tight with genuine concern. Yes, I replied, opening my eyes. The fear was completely gone. In its place was a cold, absolute certainty. I need you to mobilize Victor. I want full surveillance on my son and my daughter-in-law. I want wiretaps on their personal cell phones, their laptops, and the main office lines at the company. I want to know every single breath they take. I am transferring a retainer of $50,000 into your offshore account right now. Consider it done, Victor said, the professional edge returning to his tone. But Richard, you need legal cover. If he has guardianship papers in play, you are a fugitive from your own life right now. You cannot stay out on the street. I know, I said, looking out the diner window at the blowing snow. I am going to disappear completely. But first, I need to make a stop. Contact Benjamin Pierce on a secure line. Tell him to meet me in 1 hour. Benjamin was my personal attorney and confidant for 3 decades. If anyone could unravel the legal noose Derek had tied around my neck, it was him. I hung up the burner phone, leaving the cold coffee on the table. I picked up my black duffel bag and walked out into the freezing wind. I was officially a dead man walking, but they were about to learn that dead men have absolutely nothing left to lose. I walked for 3 blocks through the biting wind, making absolutely sure I was not being followed. The industrial district of Chicago is a maze of forgotten warehouses and chain-link fences, a perfect place to disappear. I found a dilapidated windowless storage facility on the edge of the rail yard. It was a property I had purchased under a shell company decades ago, a quiet asset even Derek did not know existed. The rusted metal door groaned heavily as I pushed it open. The air inside smelled of dust, motor oil, and old machinery. I walked down a dimly lit concrete corridor to Unit 42. I unlocked the heavy padlock and stepped inside the freezing room. Benjamin Pierce was already waiting for me. He was sitting on a folding metal chair under a single flickering fluorescent bulb. Benjamin had been my personal attorney, my legal attack dog, and my closest confidant for 30 years. He was a man of impeccable tailored suits and razor-sharp intellect. Right now, he looked entirely out of place in the dusty storage unit, holding a thick manila folder in his lap. He stood up as I entered, his usually stoic face etched with deep, unmistakable horror. "Richard," he said, his voice barely a whisper echoing off the concrete walls. "When Victor called me, I thought he was out of his mind. I thought this was some kind of paranoid misunderstanding. But then I pulled the county records. I set my black duffel bag on the cold floor and pulled up another folding chair. I sat down, my knees aching slightly from the bitter chill in the air. Tell me, Benjamin. Tell me exactly how my own son executed me." Benjamin opened the manila folder. His hands, usually so steady in the most brutal courtrooms, were trembling slightly. He pulled out a thick stack of legally stamped documents and slid them slowly across the small folding table between us. I instantly recognized the blue ink of my own signature at the bottom of the pages. These were the tax extension forms Derek had brought to my study. The ones I signed without my reading glasses. The ones I signed because I trusted the boy I raised with my entire soul. "They are not tax extensions," Richard Benjamin said, heavily pointing to the top page. The front page was a dummy sheet, a simple corporate cover letter meant to blind you. But the pages beneath it, the ones you initialed and signed, constitute a total surrender of your life. This first document is an ironclad, irrevocable medical power of attorney. It grants Derek absolute control over every single aspect of your physical and mental health care. He has the legal authority to commit you to any medical facility, authorize any psychiatric procedure, and administer any medication he deems necessary entirely without your consent. I stared at my signature. It looked like a death warrant drawn in blue ink. "And the logistics company?" I asked, my voice as cold as the air around us. Benjamin pulled out the second document, his jaw tight. "It is gone, Richard. This is a legally binding transfer of all your executive voting rights and personal shares into a blind trust. The designated sole trustee of that fund is your son. He now has complete, undisputed control over Caldwell Logistics. He can liquidate major assets, fire the entire board of directors, or sell the whole supply chain to a rival firm. You handed him the keys to the kingdom while you were grieving. I leaned back in the metal chair, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the theft. 40 years of blood, sweat, and freezing nights on the highway erased with a few strokes of a pen. I had built a massive fortress to protect my family, and my son had simply locked me outside of it. So we freeze it immediately, I said, looking up at Benjamin with a hard stare. We file a legal injunction. We go to a federal judge tomorrow morning, claim undeniable fraud, and I testify that I was deceived under extreme emotional duress. I will tell the court he took advantage of my grief over Martha to steal my life's work. Benjamin shook his head slowly. The despair in his eyes deepened into something resembling pure defeat. You cannot do that, Richard. If you walk into a police station or a courthouse right now, you will never walk out as a free man. What do you mean? I demanded, my hands curling into fists on the table. I am of sound mind. I am the legal founder of the company. I have constitutional rights. Not anymore, Benjamin whispered. He pulled a third document from the bottom of the folder. It was printed on the heavy textured letterhead of a highly exclusive private psychiatric clinic located in downtown Chicago. This is the final nail in the coffin, Richard. Derek did not just steal your money and your medical rights. He destroyed your legal humanity. I took the paper from his hands. It was a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation signed and stamped by a doctor named Eris Thorne, a specialist with a supposedly flawless reputation in the city. I began to read the clinical detached language. The words hit me harder than any physical blow I had ever taken in my life. According to this sworn medical affidavit, Benjamin explained, tracing his finger over the damning paragraphs, Dr. Thorne has allegedly evaluated you over the past 6 months. He claims that following the traumatic passing of your wife Martha, you have suffered a catastrophic mental collapse. The official diagnosis is severe rapid-onset dementia compounded by aggressive self-destructive tendencies and acute unmanageable paranoia. I stared at the paper in absolute disbelief. I have never met this doctor in my entire life, I said, my voice rising with a sudden sharp fury that cut through the cold air. This is a complete fabrication. This is a disgusting lie bought and paid for with my own money. Of course it is a lie, Benjamin replied, running a hand over his tired face. Victor is already looking into Dr. Thorne. We heavily suspect Derek paid him an exorbitant sum through an untraceable offshore shell company to write this evaluation without ever putting you in a consultation room. But legally speaking, Richard, this piece of paper is a loaded gun pointed directly at your head. Derek filed this evaluation with the county clerk alongside the medical power of attorney. It establishes a massive legal precedent that you are entirely incompetent. It legally validates the transfer of the company because it paints a perfect picture of a devoted, loving son stepping in to save his dying, delusional father from ruining the family business. I felt the concrete walls of the small storage unit closing in on me. The absolute brilliance of Derek's trap was truly breathtaking. It was a masterpiece of legal suffocation. If you go to the police right now and claim your son kidnapped you and stole your company, Benjamin continued, his voice incredibly grim, they will look at your file. They will see a diagnosis of severe paranoia and dementia. They will see that Derek is your legal medical guardian. They will not arrest Derek for fraud. They will call him to come pick you up. And because the evaluation explicitly states you are a physical danger to yourself and others, Derek will have the immediate legal right to have you forcibly sedated, strapped to a medical gurney, and flown on a private transport straight to that nightmare facility in Nassau. By trying to fight him out in the open, you would be handing him the exact excuse he needs to institutionalize you legally. You are legally a dead man walking, Richard, Benjamin finished softly, closing the manila folder. In the eyes of the law, your brain is gone, your voice means absolutely nothing, and Derek is your savior. I sat in the freezing silence of the storage unit for a very long time. I looked at the forged signature of the corrupt doctor. I looked at my own signature on the power of attorney. My own grief had been brutally weaponized against me. They had used my profound love for Martha, my exhaustion, and my blind trust as the very ropes to hang me. Derek had orchestrated a flawless corporate assassination, and he had done it with a warm smile and a comforting pat on the back. The sheer injustice of it burned fiercely through my veins, but I did not let the fire consume me. I let it forge me into something harder. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy air fill my lungs and clear my mind. I carefully placed the forged psychiatric evaluation back onto the table. Benjamin watched me closely, his eyes searching my face for a reaction. "What do we do, Richard? We cannot fight this through normal legal channels. He holds all the cards. If he even suspects you are still in Chicago, he will send private security contractors to hunt you down." I looked at my oldest friend, the ghost of a dark smile touching the corners of my mouth. "No, Benjamin," I said softly. "He thinks he holds all the cards, but he forgot exactly who taught him how to play the game. He thinks I am a broken old man who will just cry and fade into the shadows. He thinks this little piece of paper makes him an invincible king." I stood up from the folding chair, my joints cracking slightly in the cold, but my posture completely straight and unyielding. "I am not going to the police. I am not going to a judge to beg on my knees for my life back. Derek wants to play in the dirt. He wants to use the shadows to destroy his own father. Then we will bring the entire foundation of his life down on his head." Benjamin stood up as well, buttoning his thick suit jacket against the chill. "What is the very next move? First, I need to know why he went this far," I said, pacing the small concrete floor. "Derek is greedy, yes. But stealing the company and shipping me off to an offshore asylum is an extreme escalation. He could have just waited for me to die naturally. He could have just asked for a larger share of the executive profits. You do not execute a plan this complex, this highly illegal and this risky just for an early inheritance. There is something else going on entirely. Something massive that he is desperately trying to cover up. He needed me completely out of the picture immediately, and he needed me declared legally insane so nothing I said would ever be trusted by the authorities." I stopped pacing and looked directly at Benjamin's eyes. "I need an inside man. I need someone who still has direct access to the real corporate ledgers, not the sanitized fake versions Derek has been showing the board of directors." "Sarah Jenkins," Benjamin suggested immediately without hesitation. "She has been the chief financial officer for 7 years. You hired her yourself straight out of her previous firm. She is fiercely loyal to you, but Derek has likely isolated her completely since he took over the executive suite. Find her." I ordered, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Do not call her office line. Do not email her personal accounts. Have Victor track her daily routine. I need to intercept her in person somewhere Derek's digital surveillance cannot possibly see us." Benjamin nodded, packing the devastating legal documents back into his leather briefcase. "And what about you, Richard? You cannot stay here in this unit. If Derek's private investigators start looking for you, they will eventually check your old hidden real estate properties." "I am going to become exactly what Derek told the entire world I am," I replied, picking up my black duffel bag and throwing it over my shoulder. "I am going to disappear into the fog. I need a place where no one looks twice at an old man with a heavy coat and a cheap bag." I walked to the rusted metal door of the storage unit and pushed it open. The biting wind of the Chicago winter howled viciously through the desolate rail yard. I stepped out into the freezing darkness, leaving my 30-year confidant behind, in the shadows. The luxury world cruise was sailing far away without me, but my real journey was just beginning. I was completely dead to the world, but in my death I had found absolute, terrifying freedom. It was the freedom to destroy the monster I had raised, brick by miserable brick. I pulled my heavy wool coat tighter around my shoulders and kept walking until the cold, desolate concrete of the rail yard gave way to the gritty, salt-stained sidewalks of the downtown transit center. It was a bleak, fluorescent-lit cavern smelling of stale pretzels, damp wool, and heavy diesel exhaust. I walked up to the Greyhound ticket counter, keeping my head down, a nondescript older man, blending perfectly into the transient crowd. I pulled out a handful of the emergency cash I had salvaged from the lining of my steamer trunks. I bought a one-way express ticket heading straight down the eastern seaboard to Miami, Florida. The clerk behind the scratched plexiglass did not even look at my face as he processed the transaction and slid the paper ticket under the partition. I took it and walked out to the boarding lanes. The massive silver bus was idling loudly, its heavy engine vibrating against the frozen pavement. Passengers were slowly shuffling aboard, carrying their entire lives in cheap canvas bags and battered suitcases. I waited until a large, distracted family pushed their way up the metal steps, and I slipped in quietly right behind them. I walked down the narrow, cramped aisle, keeping my posture hunched. About halfway to the back of the bus, I found an empty row. I reached deep into the inner pocket of my coat and pulled out my original smartphone. This was the device legally tied to Richard Caldwell. This was the phone I knew Derek's security team had undoubtedly bugged with highly advanced GPS tracking software. I left the power on. I leaned over, pretending to tie my shoe, and slid the phone deep underneath the stained fabric of the seat, wedging it tightly between the metal frame and the floor heating vent. Let him track that. By the time Derek's offshore contacts call him to report that I never arrived at the cargo port, his private security will scramble to find my digital signal. They will pull up the tracking software and see my phone moving at 65 miles an hour down the interstate, heading toward the Florida swamps. They will assume the old man panicked, somehow figured out the trap at the last possible minute, and ran as far away as possible in a blind terror. It would completely throw them off the scent of my actual location. I stood back up, muttered a polite apology to the woman sitting across the aisle, and stepped quickly off the bus, just as the pneumatic doors began to hiss shut. I stood on the freezing platform and watched the heavy vehicle pull out of the terminal, taking my digital identity and Derek's only lead with it. I was finally completely invisible. Now I needed a fortress. I spent the next 2 hours walking deeper into the city's forgotten industrial sector. I bypassed the commercial chain hotels and the halfway decent establishments where a man with my face might be recognized. I needed a place that did not ask questions, did not have digital guest registries, and operated strictly in the shadows. I found it sitting in the desolate shadow of an abandoned steel mill. The neon sign buzzed and flickered erratically in the freezing Chicago rain, advertising the Crossroads Motel with 3 burnt-out letters. The cracked asphalt parking lot was filled with rusted-out cars and broken glass. I walked into the cramped, overheated lobby. The man behind the bulletproof glass was watching a small television and barely glanced up as I approached the counter. I asked for a room in the back, far from the street, with no adjoining doors. I paid for 2 weeks in advance using crisp $20 bills. When he pushed the greasy paper guest ledger toward me, I signed the name Arthur Pendleton with a cheap ballpoint pen. He grunted and handed me a heavy brass key attached to a faded, scratched plastic tag. Room number 14. I walked around the back of the dilapidated building. The winter wind howled violently through the chain-link fences as I unlocked the thin wooden door and pushed it open. The room smelled heavily of old cigarette smoke, damp mildew, and cheap pine cleaner. The carpet was deeply stained, and the thin floral bedspread had visible cigarette burns in the fabric. A single flickering bulb illuminated a small, battered laminate desk pushed into the far corner. For 40 years, I had slept on imported Egyptian cotton. I had walked on custom-heated marble floors. I had lived in a world of absolute untouchable luxury, but standing in that squalid, freezing motel room, dropping my cheap black duffel bag onto the sagging mattress, I felt absolutely no despair. I felt a dangerous, vibrating energy settling deep into my bones. This was not a prison. This was a war room. This was the exact place where the Caldwell empire would be systematically taken back. My burner phone vibrated quietly in my pocket. It was Victor. He had received my secure coordinates and was already mobilizing his assets. Within 3 hours, there was a quiet, highly specific rhythmic knock at the motel room door. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. I opened it to find one of Victor's associates, a completely unremarkable-looking man wearing a heavy raincoat, standing in the freezing drizzle. He was holding a thick, reinforced black briefcase. He handed it to me without uttering a single word, turned on his heel, and walked away into the dark parking lot. I closed the door, threw the heavy iron deadbolt, and carried the briefcase over to the laminate desk. Inside was exactly what I had paid a small fortune for. A heavily encrypted military-grade laptop, untraceable cellular routers, and a secure satellite uplink system. I booted up the machine. The screen glowed an icy pale blue, throwing sharp shadows against the peeling wallpaper of the motel room. A secure, encrypted messaging window opened instantly on the desktop. Victor was on the other end. The digital wiretaps were fully active. The surveillance network was in place. He had bypassed the security firewalls and tapped directly into the high-definition security cameras of my own home in Winnetka. I clicked on the primary video file Victor sent over. The screen buffered for a fraction of a second before the feed from my own grand living room faded perfectly into view. I pulled up the creaking wooden chair and sat down to watch. It was Friday night. I had been supposedly gone banished to the offshore asylum for exactly 3 days. The grand marble foyer I had built with decades of my own sweat sacrifice and freezing nights on the road was packed with people. But they were not my friends. They were Derek and Natalie's inner circle. Young, ruthless corporate climbers, wealthy trust fund heirs, and shallow sycophants. They were throwing a massive, lavishly catered party. It was a celebration of my absolute demise. I watched the silent video feed with a heart made of absolute ice. I saw Natalie standing proudly by the grand stone fireplace, laughing loudly, with a group of women holding expensive champagne flutes. The camera zoomed in, slightly controlled by Victor remotely. My breath caught in my throat. Natalie was wearing Martha's diamond tennis bracelet. The exact bracelet I had bought my wife for our 25th wedding anniversary. She had not even waited a full week to raid my dead wife's jewelry box and parade her stolen treasures around my living room. She raised her glass, her face glowing with pure, unadulterated greed and untouchable arrogance. Then the camera feed panned to the main staircase. Derek was standing on the grand landing, holding a microphone. Victor had managed to sync the audio from one of the tapped cellular phones in the room, feeding the sound directly into the video stream. I turned up the volume on the encrypted laptop. Derek's voice filled the squalid, freezing motel room, echoing off the cheap walls. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," my son said, his voice projecting a perfectly practiced, sickening look of solemn duty. As many of you know, my father's health has rapidly declined over the past year. The immense grief of losing my mother finally broke his mind. It has been a terrible, agonizing tragedy for our family. But we have ensured he is receiving the best, most secure care possible at a private medical facility far away from the stress of the city, where he can no longer harm himself. He paused, bowing his head and letting a fake, dramatic sigh escape his lips. The crowd murmured in sympathetic agreement. It was a flawless, sociopathic performance, but Caldwell Logistics must move forward. Derek continued, his voice suddenly rising, with arrogant, undeniable triumph. Effective immediately, the board of directors has fully approved my ascension to Chief Executive Officer. We are liquidating the old stagnant assets. We are modernizing the supply chain. We are taking this empire into a completely new era. I raise my glass to the future and to absolute freedom. The crowd erupted into cheers. I watched them drink my vintage wine. I watched them dance on the expensive hardwood floors I had paid for with broken knuckles and relentless labor. I watched the boy I loved, the boy I would have died for, celebrate my living death with a triumphant smile on his face. I sat in the darkness of the motel room, and I did not shed a single tear. The father who loved Derek was officially dead. The man sitting in that chair was the founder of Caldwell Logistics, and he was ready to go to war. I reached out and closed the laptop screen. The room plunged back into the dim, flickering light of the single bulb. They thought they had won. They thought they had buried a confused, broken old man who would simply fade away in the shadows. But they had made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. They had forgotten that I built the entire chessboard they were currently playing on. I picked up the untraceable burner phone and dialed Benjamin's secure line. He answered on the very first ring. "Benjamin," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the room like a surgical scalpel. "It is time to make our move. Find Sarah Jenkins. I do not care what it takes. I need the real corporate ledgers, and I need them tonight. The illusion of peace is over. We are going to burn their new era straight to the ground." Victor did not disappoint. Within 48 hours, his surveillance network had mapped out every single movement Sarah Jenkins made. Since Derek had taken over the executive suite, Sarah's routine had drastically changed. She was no longer leaving the office at 5 in the evening. She was working brutally late, often not exiting the downtown Caldwell Logistics headquarters until past midnight. Victor's operatives reported that she looked constantly exhausted, nervously checking over her shoulder and avoiding all social contact with the other board members. She was a woman buckling under the weight of a massive, terrifying secret. I knew I had to corner her where Derek's private security cameras could not reach. The corporate parking structure was a fortress, heavily monitored on the upper executive levels, but the sub-basement level reserved for long-term fleet storage and overflow parking was a notoriously neglected concrete cavern. Victor had managed to remotely disable the 2 security cameras covering the sub-basement elevators. That was my window. On a freezing Tuesday night, slightly past 1 in the morning, I stood waiting in the suffocating darkness of the underground garage. The air down there was heavy thick with the smell of damp concrete, old motor oil, and exhaust fumes. I leaned against a concrete pillar, perfectly concealed in the deep shadows, wearing my heavy wool overcoat and a dark fedora pulled low over my eyes. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional distant drip of water from a leaking overhead pipe. I was entirely, perfectly still. I had trained myself to wait. 40 years of outsmarting rival freight moguls had taught me that patience was the deadliest weapon a man could wield. Finally, the heavy metal doors of the service elevator groaned open at the far end of the corridor. The harsh fluorescent lights of the elevator car spilled out onto the dark concrete floor. Sarah Jenkins stepped out into the cavernous garage. She was a brilliant woman, a mathematical genius I had personally hired 7 years ago to modernize our entire financial infrastructure. She had always carried herself with absolute confidence, walking with her head held high and a binder of financial projections tucked firmly under her arm. But the woman walking toward me now was a complete shadow of her former self. Her shoulders were slumped. Her expensive, tailored suit looked slightly disheveled. She was clutching her leather briefcase to her chest, as if it were a physical shield. Her footsteps echoed hollowly across the empty parking deck as she hurried toward her silver sedan, parked under a flickering light bulb. She fumbled nervously with her keys, her hands shaking so badly she dropped them onto the cold pavement. She let out a quiet, desperate sob as she bent down to pick them up. I stepped out from behind the concrete pillar. The dull scrape of my leather shoes against the pavement was the only sound. "Hello, Sarah," I said. My voice was low, smooth, and completely devoid of any warmth. It resonated through the empty garage like a physical blow. Sarah gasped violently, spinning around and dropping her keys again. She backed up against the side of her car, her eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. For a long, agonizing moment, she just stared at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. In the dim, flickering light, I could see the profound shock registering on her pale face. She looked at me as if she were staring directly at a ghost. And legally speaking, she was. Derek had ensured that the entire corporate world believed I was rotting in a heavily medicated stupor on a tropical island. "Mr. Caldwell," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently it was barely audible. "Richard. But how? Derek said you were gone. He said you were deeply sick. He told the board you were in a secure medical facility in the Bahamas. He said your mind was completely broken." "My mind has never been sharper, Sarah," I replied calmly, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. I kept my hands casually in my coat pockets, maintaining a perfectly relaxed posture to contrast her absolute panic. But Derek is a very creative storyteller. He built a beautiful legal coffin for me. He had a corrupt doctor forge a psychiatric evaluation, and he hijacked my company while I was mourning my wife. I know about the power of attorney. I know about the blind trust. I know everything about the hostile takeover. What I do not know, Sarah, is why you let him do it. I stopped just a few feet away from her. I looked deeply into her terrified eyes. You were my chief financial officer. I trusted you with the lifeblood of this empire. I gave you that position when the rest of the board wanted an older, more traditional candidate. I backed you. And yet when my son executed a completely fraudulent corporate coup, you stood by silently and watched him lock me out of my own life. I need to know exactly why you betrayed me. The word betrayal hit her like a physical strike. Sarah broke down completely. The professional veneer shattered, and she began to weep openly, her hands covering her face. She slid down the side of her silver sedan until she was sitting on the freezing concrete floor, pulling her knees to her chest. I did not move to comfort her. I did not offer her a handkerchief. I just stood there towering over her in the dim light, waiting for the truth to spill out. I did not want to betray you, Richard, she sobbed, looking up at me with tears streaming down her face. You have to believe me. I tried to stop him. When Derek first brought the blind trust documents to the executive committee, I knew immediately that something was fundamentally wrong. I demanded to speak to you. I told him I was going to call your personal attorney. But Derek was ready for me. He did not just bring fake medical evaluations. He brought leverage. Terrible, inescapable leverage. She wiped her eyes with the back of her trembling hand and took a deep, shuddering breath. He called me into your old office the night before you supposedly left for the cruise. He closed the doors and handed me a thick file. It was full of completely fabricated, highly sophisticated financial records. He had spent the last 6 months secretly using my digital authorization codes to move massive amounts of corporate capital through offshore shell accounts. He deliberately created a digital paper trail that looked exactly like I had been systematically embezzling corporate funds to avoid federal taxes. I narrowed my eyes, processing the sheer sociopathic brilliance of my son's planning. He framed you, I stated coldly. He framed me perfectly. Sarah cried, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that if I ever breathed a single word about his medical power of attorney, or if I tried to contact you, he would immediately hand that file over to the federal authorities. He said he would ensure I spent the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate tax fraud. He threatened to ruin my entire life, Richard. He said he would take my house, my savings, and ensure my children grew up visiting their mother behind reinforced glass. I was terrified. He held all the cards. I had absolutely no way to prove he forged the digital signatures. He forced me to smile and nod at the board meetings while he systematically dismantled everything you built. I looked down at the weeping woman. I understood her terror. Derek had used the exact same weapon on her that he had used on me. He had weaponized our love and our fear to bind our hands. He was a monster wearing an expensive tailored suit, operating with total impunity. But Derek had made a critical error. He had assumed that fear would keep Sarah permanently paralyzed. He had forgotten that when you push a brilliant, desperate person into a corner, they eventually start looking for a weapon to fight back. Sarah reached a shaking hand into her leather briefcase. She bypassed the neat folders and the corporate binders, digging deep into a hidden zippered compartment in the lining. She pulled out a small metallic object. It was a high-capacity, heavily encrypted solid-state flash drive. She held it out to me, her hand trembling so badly the metal clicked against her wedding ring. "What is this?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as I reached out and took the cold drive from her hand. "It is the real ledger," she whispered back, staring at the small device as if it were an unexploded bomb. Derek thinks he completely scrubbed the main servers. He thinks he destroyed all the original accounting records when he took over. But he does not understand the proprietary financial architecture I built for this company. I designed a redundant deep-level shadow backup that updates automatically every single midnight. He could not erase it because he never even knew it existed. I have been secretly downloading the actual financial data every night before I leave the building. I held the flash drive up to the dim light. It felt heavier than a block of solid gold. What exactly is on this drive, Sarah? I need to know what I am walking into. Why did he go to such extreme lengths to steal the company and legally execute me? Sarah stood up slowly, her legs shaking. She leaned closer to me, her voice dropping to a terrified, breathless whisper. Because it is not just a hostile takeover, Richard. It is a massive, ongoing federal crime. Derek and Natalie have not just been spending your corporate profits. They have been actively embezzling from the employee pension fund. The fund you set up 30 years ago for the drivers and the warehouse workers. They drained it, Richard. They took millions upon millions of dollars to cover massive catastrophic losses they incurred in unregulated offshore cryptocurrency markets and illegal real estate syndications. The air in my lungs turned instantly to solid ice. The pension fund. That was sacred money. That was the life savings of the men and women who had broken their backs loading freight in the freezing rain to build my empire. The federal investigators have already started noticing the discrepancies. Sarah continued, fresh tears welling in her eyes. The audit flags were triggered 3 weeks ago. Derek panicked. That is why he had to get rid of you so fast. He needed you out of the country, declared legally insane and stripped of your power. Because the fake digital paper trail he created does not just frame me for tax fraud. It frames you for the pension embezzlement. He planted evidence to make it look like his grieving, demented father stole the pension money in a state of severe paranoia before completely losing his mind. He was going to let the federal government indict you, and you would be locked away in that asylum entirely unable to defend yourself. I stood in the absolute silence of the underground garage, my fingers tightening around the cold metal flash drive until they ached. The scale of the betrayal was no longer just a family tragedy. It was a breathtaking, monstrous atrocity. My son was not just a thief. He was willing to destroy the lives of thousands of my loyal employees, and he was perfectly willing to let me take the fall and die in a pharmaceutical prison to save his own skin. I looked at Sarah. Her face was pale, waiting for my reaction. She expected me to explode. She expected me to rage against the concrete walls. Instead, I felt a strange, absolute calm wash over my mind. The furnace of my anger cooled into a singular razor-sharp point of execution. The father was truly finally dead. The architect of Caldwell Logistics was fully awake. "Go home, Sarah," I said smoothly, slipping the encrypted flash drive into my coat pocket. "Go home, hug your children, and go to work tomorrow as if absolutely nothing has happened. Smile at Derek, nod at his meetings, give him the absolute illusion of total control." "But what are you going to do, Richard?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "I am going to take this drive," I replied, turning away from her and walking slowly back into the suffocating darkness of the garage. "And I am going to build a guillotine." I walked through the freezing rain, the small metal flash drive burning a hole in my heavy coat pocket. The streets of the industrial district were completely empty, mirroring the desolation I felt inside. There was no longer any room for sorrow. Sorrow had been entirely replaced by a cold clarity. I reached the Crossroads Motel, my boots splashing through the cracked asphalt puddles, and let myself into the squalid room. The smell of stale tobacco and damp carpet was familiar. I picked up the untraceable burner phone and dialed Victor's secure line. I told him to drop the surveillance he was running and get to my room immediately. I had the keys to the kingdom, but they were heavily locked, and I needed his expertise to pry them open. Victor arrived less than 30 minutes later. He did not bother knocking. He used the duplicate brass key and stepped quietly into the room, shaking the freezing rain from his heavy leather jacket. He looked at the grim expression on my face and did not say a word. He simply walked over to the small laminate desk, opened his reinforced briefcase, and pulled out a specialized decryption terminal. I handed him the flash drive Sarah Jenkins had given me. It felt incredibly heavy, a tiny metal box containing the absolute destruction of my own son. Victor plugged the drive into the terminal and began typing furiously. The screen of the military-grade laptop glowed a harsh pale blue, casting long, menacing shadows across the peeling wallpaper. "Sarah is a brilliant architect," Victor murmured, his eyes locked on the scrolling lines of code. "This is 25 6-bit encryption. It is federal-grade security. If she had not given you the backdoor passcode sequence, it would take a supercomputer 3 decades to crack this." I gave him the 12-digit numerical sequence Sarah had whispered to me in the dark garage. Victor entered it carefully. The machine paused for a long, agonizing minute. The only sound in the freezing motel room was the heavy rain lashing against the thin window pane and the quiet hum of the laptop cooling fan. Then the screen flashed green. "Access granted." "Pull up the main ledger," I instructed, pulling a creaking wooden chair up to the desk. "I want to see the last 6 months of executive transfers." Victor navigated through the complex directory of shadow files and opened the master financial spreadsheet. The sheer volume of data was staggering, but my eyes were trained by 40 years of reading corporate margins. I knew exactly where to look. I told him to filter the outgoing capital by department, specifically targeting the off-book venture divisions Derek had established when he became vice president. As the numbers populated on the glowing screen, the air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart pounding, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The numbers were not just wrong. They were utterly catastrophic. "Stop right there." I pointed at a series of massive, staggered withdrawals originating from our secondary holding accounts. "Look at the routing numbers. Where did this capital go?" Victor's fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the digital pathways. He opened a subfolder hidden deep within the directory. "These are wire transfers to unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges," he said, his voice dropping to a low, tight whisper. "And here a massive funnel into a series of highly leveraged, high-risk commercial real estate flips in Dubai and Singapore. Richard, these markets completely collapsed 3 months ago." "How much did he lose?" I asked, my voice devoid of any emotion. Victor ran the final calculation. The number flashed on the screen in glaring red font. $18 million. I sat back in the wooden chair, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. 18 million. It was a sum so massive it threatened to completely bankrupt the operational cash flow of Caldwell Logistics. Derek and Natalie had not just been living a lavish lifestyle. They had been gambling with the entire empire, trying to multiply their wealth in the shadows, and they had lost absolutely everything. But the company accounts did not have $18 million in liquid capital just sitting around to be stolen. He had to have pulled it from a deeply secured reserve. "Pull up the employee pension fund," I commanded, a sudden sickening dread washing over me. Victor hesitated for a fraction of a second, understanding the absolute gravity of that request. He clicked on the secure directory labeled for the Union Retirement Reserves. The spreadsheet opened. The balance, which should have shown decades of careful compounding growth to protect the thousands of men and women who drove my trucks, was completely decimated. The $18 million had been systematically drained directly from the pension reserves, masked as authorized high-yield corporate reinvestments. "He stole their futures," I whispered, the ice in my veins turning into boiling rage. "He stole the retirement money of men who broke their backs for me. Men who trusted me with their families." "It gets much worse, Richard," Victor said, his eyes scanning a separate folder that had just finished decrypting. He clicked open a series of scanned, highly confidential legal documents. "This folder is labeled Operation Firewall. These are intercepted communications from the federal government. The FBI has already noticed the discrepancies. The Department of Labor initiated a silent audit of your pension fund 4 weeks ago. Derek's digital encryption was sloppy. The feds found the hole. They are currently building a massive federal indictment for wire fraud and pension embezzlement. I looked at the dates on the intercepted federal emails. 4 weeks ago. That was exactly when Derek suddenly started talking about my declining mental health. That was exactly when he bought the ticket for the world cruise and forged the medical power of attorney. The entire timeline clicked into place with horrifying mathematical precision. He did not just steal the company. I said the absolute monstrous truth finally laying bare before me. He was never just trying to force an early inheritance. He was building a scapegoat. Victor opened the final document in the folder. It was a perfectly fabricated digital log. It showed my personal IP address, my secure executive passwords, and my digital authorization codes executing the $18 million transfer into the offshore cryptocurrency accounts. Derek had meticulously planted a false trail over the last 6 months. To the FBI forensic accountants, it would look exactly like Richard Caldwell, a grieving, severely depressed older man, had lost his mind and gambled away the company pension fund in a manic episode. "He framed you," Victor said, turning to look at me, his face pale in the blue light of the monitor. "The federal indictment is not naming Derek. It is naming you. The FBI is preparing to issue a warrant for your arrest." The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of my son's plan settled over me like a suffocating shroud. He knew the FBI was coming. He knew someone had to go to federal prison for the missing $18 million. So he created a perfect narrative. The legendary founder of Caldwell Logistics, driven insane by the tragic death of his wife, destroys his own company and steals his employees' life savings. But to make the frame-up work flawlessly, Derek needed one final piece of the puzzle. He needed me completely silenced. If the FBI arrested me here in Chicago, I would hire lawyers. I would order an independent audit. I would fight back, and I would eventually prove that Derek stole my digital credentials. He could not risk me sitting in a federal courtroom. He could not risk me testifying. That is why he sent me to the St. Jude facility in Nassau, I said, my voice eerily calm, though the fury inside me was hot enough to melt steel. If I am locked in an offshore asylum, heavily sedated and legally declared incompetent, I cannot testify. The American authorities cannot extradite a mentally incapacitated man from that specific Bahamian jurisdiction. I would just rot in a padded cell completely out of reach. The FBI would freeze my personal assets, close the case, and Derek would inherit the remaining clean pieces of the company as the heroic, tragic son who tried to save his father from madness. He planned to let me die in the dark so he could walk away completely free. Victor closed the laptop screen. The room plunged back into the dim, flickering light of the single bulb. We sat in the freezing silence, listening to the rain beat against the glass. The illusion of my family was completely dead. The boy I had raised, the boy I had loved with every ounce of my being, was a sociopath who had engineered a masterpiece of absolute betrayal. He was perfectly willing to let thousands of hard-working families lose their pensions, and he was perfectly willing to bury his own father alive in a foreign prison to avoid facing the consequences of his own greed. "We have to go to the authorities," Victor finally said, his voice heavy. "We have the decrypted drive. We have the proof of the real transfers. We take this to the FBI tomorrow morning, and we let them arrest him." "No," I replied softly, staring at the closed laptop. Victor frowned. "Richard, you are facing a massive federal indictment. You cannot handle this internally. This is beyond corporate warfare. If the FBI finds you before we hand over this drive, they will arrest you on sight." I stood up from the wooden chair and walked over to the small window, looking out at the desolate, rain-swept parking lot. "I am not going to the FBI as a victim," I said, my reflection staring back at me in the dark glass. "If I hand this drive over now, the federal prosecutors will tie this up in court for 5 years. Derek will hire expensive defense attorneys. He will drag my name, my wife's memory, and my company through the mud. He will claim Sarah Jenkins faked this drive. He will claim I am a delusional old man trying to ruin him. I will not give him the dignity of a long, drawn-out legal battle." I turned back to Victor. My eyes were completely dry. My heart was a stone. I built Caldwell Logistics with my own 2 hands, I said, my voice projecting the absolute, unquestionable authority of a king reclaiming his throne. I wrote the foundational bylaws. I laid every single brick of that empire. Derek thinks he circumvented my power by stealing my voting shares. But he is arrogant and he is lazy. He never read the original corporate charter from 1985. Victor narrowed his eyes, confused. What does a charter from 40 years ago have to do with the federal embezzlement case? Because, Victor, I built a trapdoor into the very foundation of this company, I explained, walking back to the desk and placing my hand flat on the military-grade laptop. A safeguard designed to completely destroy anyone who attempted to gut the company from the inside. It is called the Golden Share, and I am going to activate it. I am not just going to send my son to prison. I am going to strip him of absolutely everything he has ever loved. I am going to make him feel the exact same terror and utter helplessness he tried to force on me. We are going to feed the wolves, Victor. I continued the plan, solidifying in my mind with terrifying precision. We are going to let him stand up in front of the entire city of Chicago at the absolute height of his arrogant triumph, and we are going to drop the guillotine blade right on his neck. I picked up the secure burner phone. Call Benjamin Pierce, I commanded. Tell him to prepare the Golden Share activation documents. Tell him to contact the lead FBI agent assigned to the Department of Labor Audit. We have a gala to attend this Friday, and we are going to bring the handcuffs with us. Victor nodded, a grim, predatory smile spreading slowly across his deeply weathered face. He quickly opened the laptop again and began to securely back up the copied files to an external remote server. The quiet, desperate war we had been fighting in the shadows was officially over. It was finally time to step back into the glaring light and watch the arrogant, foolish monster burn completely to the ground. The morning after Victor decrypted the drive, I woke up before the sun had even considered rising over the frozen Chicago skyline. For the first time in an entire year, the suffocating, heavy blanket of grief that had weighed down my chest was entirely gone. It had not miraculously healed, and I had not simply moved on from losing Martha. Instead, that profound sorrow had been subjected to the absolute blistering heat of my son's betrayal, and it had been forged into something else entirely. It had been forged into a weapon. I sat on the edge of the sagging motel bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, and I felt a dangerous, terrifyingly calm energy humming through my veins. I was no longer a mourning widower. I was no longer a victim hiding in the shadows. I was the architect of a multi-million-dollar empire, and my mind was entirely clear. I packed my few belongings into the cheap black duffel bag and walked out into the biting winter air. Benjamin Pierce was already waiting for me. In his idling car, parked 2 blocks away from the motel to avoid any unwanted attention. I climbed into the passenger seat, the leather interior, a stark contrast to the squalor I had been living in. Benjamin looked at me, his eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation or fatigue. He found absolutely none. I handed him a printed copy of the decrypted financial ledgers and the intercepted federal emails. He spent 10 minutes reading through the documents in complete silence. When he finally looked up, his face was pale, and his hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The sheer audacity of the embezzlement had shocked even my hardened, cynical attorney. "We cannot simply spring the trap at the corporate gala," Benjamin said, his voice low and serious. "If you walk into that room and accuse Derek of federal wire fraud, his immediate countermove will be to invoke the forged psychiatric evaluation. He will tell the board of directors and the police that you are having a severe paranoid delusion. He will use his medical power of attorney to have you restrained and medicated before you can even show the flash drive to the authorities. We have to completely dismantle his legal shield before we strike." "I know," I replied, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "That is why we are not going to the police today. We are going to a doctor, but not just any doctor. We are going to the highest medical authority we can possibly find in this state." Benjamin nodded, shifting the car into drive. He had spent the entire night making highly confidential phone calls to his most trusted contacts in the medical legal field. We drove for 2 hours, leaving the gritty industrial district far behind, heading toward a highly secure independent psychiatric research institute, affiliated with the Federal Medical Board. This was not a private clinic where wealthy families could discreetly purchase convenient diagnoses for their problematic relatives. This was an uncorrupted, rigorously monitored facility that routinely performed competency evaluations for high-level federal judges, politicians, and military officials. Their findings were considered absolute, unassailable legal gospel in any court of law. We arrived at a sprawling modern glass and steel complex, surrounded by quiet, snow-covered pine trees. We walked through the sliding glass doors, bypassing the standard reception area. Benjamin had arranged a private, unlisted meeting with Dr. Elias Vance, the chief of forensic psychiatry at the institute. Dr. Vance was a stern, highly analytical man in his late 60s. He did not care about my wealth. He did not care about the Caldwell logistics empire. He only cared about the objective, measurable truth of the human brain. We sat in his brightly lit clinical office, and Benjamin laid out the exact situation. He presented the forged evaluation signed by the corrupt doctor Derek had hired. Dr. Vance read the forged document with a look of deep, professional disgust. According to this paperwork, Mr. Caldwell, you are currently suffering from rapid-onset dementia, severe cognitive decline, and aggressive paranoia, he said, placing the papers flat on his desk. If what your attorney says is true, and this diagnosis was purchased to facilitate a hostile corporate takeover, it is a profound violation of medical ethics. But I cannot simply write you a new certificate based on your word. If you want a counter-evaluation that will hold up against a federal subpoena, you have to undergo our most grueling, comprehensive cognitive and psychological gauntlet. It will take 3 full days. It will be exhausting, invasive, and aggressively thorough. We will test every single aspect of your memory, your logic, your emotional stability, and your neurological health. I looked him directly in the eye, my expression completely flat. Tell me where to sit, doctor. Let us begin immediately. The first day was entirely dedicated to cognitive endurance and spatial reasoning. I was placed in a quiet, sterile room and subjected to hours of relentless, complex testing. They made me memorize massive sequences of random numbers, recite them backward, and then recall them again hours later after being distracted by highly complicated logic puzzles. They tested my ability to recognize shifting patterns, to solve abstract mathematical equations, and to process rapidly changing information. They were actively looking for the microscopic fractures in my mind, the tiny hesitations and memory lapses that signal the beginning of dementia. They found absolutely nothing. My brain, trained by 4 decades of managing chaotic international shipping routes, union negotiations, and complex corporate margins, tore through their tests with ruthless mathematical efficiency. I did not stumble. I did not hesitate. I answered every single question with a cold, sharp precision that clearly surprised the administering technicians. The second day was far more invasive. It was the psychological deep dive. Dr. Vance personally conducted this phase. We sat in comfortable chairs in a soundproof room, and he systematically attempted to break down my emotional barriers. He pushed me aggressively on the topic of my late wife, Martha. He wanted to see if the grief had truly fractured my reality, as Derek's forged paperwork claimed. He asked me brutal, highly specific questions about her death, about my feelings of isolation, and about the massive emptiness of my house. He was looking for signs of clinical depression, dangerous paranoia, or a detachment from the real world. I did not hide my sorrow from him. I spoke about Martha with absolute honesty. I told him how much I missed the smell of her baking and the sound of her voice. I explained the profound, aching loneliness of waking up in a massive, empty house. But I also explained with absolute chilling rationality the difference between human grief and mental illness. I told him that my sadness did not impair my ability to read a balance sheet. I told him that crying for my wife in the dark did not mean I had lost the capacity to understand that my son was committing federal wire fraud. I systematically deconstructed my own mourning process, proving to the doctor that I was completely fundamentally grounded in reality. I showed him that I was not a broken old man hiding from the world, but a highly calculating strategist who was temporarily blinded by love and who was now entirely awake. By the end of the second day, Dr. Vance closed his thick notebook. The clinical detachment in his eyes had been entirely replaced by a look of profound respect. He recognized that he was not sitting across from a psychiatric patient. He was sitting across from a general preparing for war. The third and final day was the physical proof. I was subjected to a battery of extensive neurological examinations. They placed me inside a massive humming magnetic resonance imaging machine to scan the physical structure of my brain. They ran blood panels to check for heavy metals or chemical imbalances. They conducted rigorous stress tests to monitor my vascular health and oxygen flow to the cerebral cortex. They were looking for the physical atrophy, the plaque buildups, or the diminished blood flow that invariably accompany the severe dementia Derek had accused me of having. When the physical testing was finally concluded, I sat back in Dr. Vance's office alongside Benjamin. The winter sun was setting outside the large glass windows, casting long, dark shadows across the room. Dr. Vance walked in carrying a thick, heavily stamped medical file. He sat down behind his desk and looked at me with a very serious, tight expression. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, his voice carrying the heavy weight of absolute medical authority. "We have reviewed your cognitive exams, your psychological profile, and your comprehensive neurological scans. The results are entirely unequivocal. Your brain shows absolutely no signs of dementia, early onset or otherwise. Your cognitive processing speeds are exceptionally high for a man of your age, likely due to your decades of intense corporate management. Your memory is flawless. Your psychological profile indicates a man experiencing entirely normal, rational grief, compounded by a highly justified anger toward a familial betrayal." He opened the file and pulled out a heavy piece of parchment paper embossed with the official seal of the Independent Federal Medical Board. "This is a legally binding certificate of absolute mental competency," Dr. Vance said, sliding the document across the desk toward me. "It is signed by myself and countersigned by 3 independent federal psychiatric examiners. It explicitly invalidates any prior diagnoses regarding your mental health. In the eyes of the highest medical and legal authorities in this country, you are entirely sane, highly capable, and fully competent to manage your own medical, financial, and legal affairs." I reached out and picked up the certificate. The paper felt heavy, carrying the undeniable weight of my absolute freedom. I looked at the signatures. I looked at the golden seal. This was not just a medical document. This was a loaded weapon. Benjamin smiled, a cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. He leaned forward, tapping the certificate with his index finger. "The moment we file this with the county clerk," he explained, his voice vibrating with anticipation, "Derek's entire legal foundation completely evaporates. The medical power of attorney he forged becomes instantly null and void. The transfer of your voting rights into his blind trust, which was predicated entirely on your supposed mental incompetence, becomes a fraudulent, illegal seizure of assets. He no longer has any legal authority over your life, your health care, or your company. You are officially back from the dead, Richard, and you are entirely untouchable." I carefully folded the certificate and slid it into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat, placing it right next to the encrypted flash drive that contained the proof of Derek's $18 million embezzlement. I had spent 3 grueling days walking through the fire of their examinations, and I had emerged completely forged in steel. My mind was sharp. My evidence was absolute. My legal shield was completely impenetrable. "Thank you, Dr. Vance," I said quietly, standing up from the chair. "You have given me exactly what I needed to reclaim my life." Dr. Vance stood up and shook my hand firmly. "Good luck, Mr. Caldwell," he said. "Whoever tried to bury you made a very profound mistake." I walked out of the facility and stepped back into the freezing Chicago evening. The air felt incredibly crisp and clean in my lungs. I looked at Benjamin, who was already pulling his cell phone out of his pocket to contact the federal authorities. The psychological counterstrike was entirely complete. I had weaponized my own sanity, turning the very concept of my mental health into a guillotine blade hanging directly over my son's neck. We had the evidence of his crimes, and we had the legal power to execute the punishment. There was nothing left to do but set the stage. We were going to the Drake Hotel, and we were going to end this. We did not return to the squalid confines of the Crossroads Motel. The time for hiding in the shadows of the industrial district had officially passed. Benjamin drove us straight into the heart of downtown Chicago, pulling his car into the secured subterranean parking garage of his own private law firm. The building was completely empty, a towering monument of glass and steel resting quietly under the winter night. We rode the private executive elevator up to the 42nd floor in absolute silence. The doors parted to reveal a sprawling, dimly lit suite of mahogany and leather. Benjamin walked directly past the polished reception desk and led me into his personal inner office. He walked over to a massive landscape painting hanging on the far wall, pulled it open on its hidden hinges, and revealed a heavy brushed steel wall safe. He spun the combination dial with practiced efficiency. The heavy locking mechanisms clicked open with a satisfying metallic thud. Benjamin reached deep into the fireproof cavern of the safe and pulled out a worn leather-bound binder. It was not a modern digital file. It was a physical relic smelling of aged paper and binding glue. He carried it over to his massive oak desk and set it down under the warm glow of a brass reading lamp. I looked at the embossed gold lettering on the cover. Caldwell Logistics Articles of Incorporation, 1985. Just looking at that binder brought back a flood of memories. I remembered sitting at a cheap kitchen table with my late wife, Martha, drafting the original vision for the company on yellow legal pads while our newborn son slept in the next room. I had built the entire empire to protect that little boy. Now I was going to use its very foundation to completely destroy him. Benjamin opened the heavy binder. The pages inside were thick, typewritten, and completely unalterable. "This is the bedrock," Benjamin said, his voice reverent in the quiet office. When Derek assumed control of the company, he filed all the modern electronic transition documents. He assumed the board of directors and the newly minted corporate bylaws were the ultimate authority. He completely bypassed the original founding charter. I pulled out one of the leather wingback chairs and sat down across from Benjamin. "Derek is a creature of the modern age," I explained, resting my hands on the cool mahogany wood of the desk. "He believes in digital ledgers, offshore cryptocurrency, and aggressive corporate takeovers. He thinks that because he controls the executive board and holds the medical power of attorney, he holds the absolute highest power in the organization. He thinks the past is just a dusty irrelevance. But he forgot that I did not inherit Caldwell Logistics. I dragged it out of the dirt with my bare hands. And when you build a fortress from the ground up, you always build a secret way to lock the gates. Turn to Section 7, Paragraph 4. Benjamin carefully turned the aged, yellowing pages until he reached the designated section. He ran his finger down the typewritten text, reading the densely worded legal clauses. He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening in profound realization. The golden share. Benjamin whispered, looking up at me with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer disbelief. "I had completely forgotten you insisted on drafting this specific clause." I leaned forward, the icy resolve in my chest hardening into pure diamond. I insisted on it because in 1985 the Chicago shipping industry was heavily infiltrated by corrupt union bosses and organized crime. I knew that if the company ever grew to a massive scale, hostile elements would eventually try to infiltrate the board and dismantle it from the inside out. I needed a fail-safe, an absolute undeniable override switch that could never be voted away, diluted, or legally challenged. The golden share is a dormant, non-transferable unit of ownership assigned exclusively to the original founding entity, and the mechanics of the clause are absolutely devastating. Benjamin continued reading aloud from the charter. In the event of immediate verifiable financial fraud or an existential threat to the primary operational capital of the corporation, The holder of the golden share is granted supreme unilateral veto power over the entire executive board. I nodded slowly. That means I have the legal authority to instantly freeze every single corporate bank account, halt all outbound financial wire transfers, and suspend every acting member of the executive committee without a single board vote. It completely supersedes his blind trust. It supersedes his position as chief executive officer. It renders his entire hostile takeover completely irrelevant. Benjamin shook his head in absolute amazement. Derek never read this, he said, letting out a short, cynical laugh. He was too arrogant. He was too focused on forging your medical evaluation and stealing the employee pension fund. He thought he had outsmarted a dinosaur, but he never bothered to check if the dinosaur had built a trap right under his feet. Because the clause requires verifiable proof of financial fraud to activate Benjamin, noted tapping the page, the encrypted flash drive from Sarah Jenkins provides the exact undeniable trigger mechanism we need. The $18 million embezzlement from the Union Pension Fund is the definitive existential threat to the corporation. I reached into my heavy wool coat and pulled out the certificate of absolute mental competency we had just secured from Dr. Vance. I placed it gently on the desk next to the 1985 charter. And because the Federal Medical Board has legally certified that I am in absolute possession of my mental faculties, I said smoothly. Derek cannot use the forged psychiatric evaluation to claim that the activation of the golden share is the act of a delusional old man. We have completely surrounded him. He has absolutely no legal exits left. Benjamin immediately pulled a stack of blank legal stationery from his desk drawer. He loaded a heavy gold-plated fountain pen and began drafting the formal activation papers for the golden share. The only sound in the office was the sharp, precise scratching of the pen against the thick parchment. I watched him write, feeling a profound sense of closure settling over me. The pain of the betrayal was still there, a dark shadow lingering in the back of my mind, but it was completely overshadowed by the cold, mechanical necessity of justice. Derek had chosen his path. He had chosen money over his own blood. He had chosen to let me rot in an offshore asylum just to cover up his own catastrophic failures. Now he was going to face the absolute fury of the man who taught him how to walk. Benjamin finished drafting the documents and pushed them across the desk toward me. "Sign here, Richard," he instructed, pointing to the bottom line. "This officially activates the clause. The moment I file this with the state corporate registry and notify the holding banks, Derek will be completely locked out. His corporate credit cards will decline. His access to the executive accounts will instantly vanish. He will be a king standing in a ruined castle with absolutely no power." I took the heavy gold fountain pen from his outstretched hand. I looked at the signature line. I thought about the thousands of loyal employees whose pension funds had been ruthlessly drained to fund his lavish lifestyle. I thought about the forged medical documents that stripped away my legal humanity. I pressed the nib of the pen against the paper and signed my name with absolute unwavering conviction. The blue ink flowed smoothly, sealing his fate. "It is done," Benjamin said, gathering the papers and placing them into a secure leather portfolio. "The golden share is fully active. Now we just have to coordinate the timing. We want the absolute maximum possible impact." "We are going to let him climb to the very highest peak of his arrogance," I replied, standing up from the wingback chair and buttoning my coat. "We are going to let him stand up in front of the entire city at the Drake Hotel Gala this Friday. We will let him give his triumphant speech about the glorious new era of Caldwell logistics. We will let him toast to his own brilliant success. And exactly at the moment he feels completely invincible, we will walk through those heavy ballroom doors and take it all away from him." Benjamin smiled, a dark, predatory gleam in his eye. "And what about the federal investigators?" he asked quietly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the encrypted flash drive. "Send this to the lead agent tomorrow morning," I commanded. "Include an anonymous handwritten note. Tell them the man who stole the $18 million will be wearing a tuxedo at the Drake Hotel on Friday night. Let the wolves completely surround the building before he even realizes that he is fatally bleeding. The next morning, the squalid room at the Crossroads Motel was completely transformed. It was no longer a place to hide. It was a tactical command center. The heavy winter rain continued to batter the thin window pane, casting a gloomy gray light across the stained carpet. I stood in the corner of the room, drinking bitter black coffee from a styrofoam cup, watching the gears of my revenge begin to turn. Victor Rossi had arrived before dawn, hauling in 2 additional reinforced briefcases containing specialized decryption hardware and high-speed digital routers. By noon, we had a visitor. There was a rapid, quiet knock at the door. I unbolted the heavy iron lock, and Sarah Jenkins stepped inside. She had slipped away from the corporate headquarters during her lunch hour, wearing a heavy trench coat over her tailored suit, her eyes darting nervously toward the desolate parking lot. She looked completely out of place in the dilapidated motel, but the sheer terror that had paralyzed her in the underground parking garage was gone. She had seen the golden share activation documents Benjamin had prepared. She knew I was taking the company back. Now she was ready to fight. Sarah walked directly over to the small laminate desk where Victor had set up his military-grade terminal. She dropped her leather briefcase onto the floor and pulled up a creaking wooden chair. For the next 3 hours, I watched a masterclass in digital forensic warfare. Victor was a creature of the shadows, an expert in breaching firewalls and tracing illicit data streams. Sarah was the absolute master architect of the Caldwell Logistics financial network. Together, they were an unstoppable force. Sarah navigated through the complex maze of the shadow ledgers she had downloaded, pulling up the exact timestamps and encrypted routing codes for the missing $18 million. Derek thought he was a genius, Sarah muttered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. He used a series of offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus to wash the pension funds before moving them into the cryptocurrency exchanges. But he did not understand how our internal data packet tagging works. Every single transfer that leaves the main executive server carries a microscopic hidden digital watermark. Victor leaned closer to the glowing screen, his eyes narrowing as he traced the digital watermarks Sarah uncovered. He cross-referenced the outgoing data packets with global internet protocol registries. He is bouncing the signal through commercial virtual private networks, Victor said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. He is trying to mask his physical location. But he is arrogant, and he got lazy. He did not build a custom encryption tunnel. He bought an off-the-shelf privacy software package. Give me 20 minutes to peel back the layers. The room fell into a tense, heavy silence. The only sound was the rapid clicking of the keyboard and the steady drumming of the rain against the glass. I watched the screen as lines of complex code cascaded downward like a digital waterfall. Finally, Victor hit the enter key with a sharp, definitive strike. The screen blinked, and a single glaring string of numbers appeared in the center of the monitor. Got him, Victor breathed, a predatory smile forming on his face. I traced the origin point of the final massive wire transfer. The one he tried to pin on your digital credentials, Richard. Where did it come from? I asked, stepping closer to the desk. Victor pointed at the screen. It did not come from your office. It did not come from your personal devices. The transfer was initiated from a private, secured residential wireless network located in Winnetka, Illinois. It came directly from Derek's personal laptop sitting inside his home office. The digital fingerprints are absolutely undeniable. He left a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to his own front door. The sheer weight of the evidence was staggering. We were no longer relying on suspicions or circumstantial clues. We had the exact weapon he used to commit the crime completely covered in his digital fingerprints. Print everything I commanded. Every single ledger, every routing number, every internet protocol log. I want it all on physical paper. I do not want the federal agents to have to dig through a hard drive to see his guilt. I want it staring them directly in the face. Victor connected a portable high-definition laser printer he had brought in his equipment cases. For the next hour, the machine hummed and whirred, spitting out stack after stack of damning financial records. I took the papers and began laying them out on the sagging motel bed, organizing them with ruthless precision. I created a timeline. I started with the initial pension fund withdrawals 6 months ago. I moved to the catastrophic losses in the unregulated cryptocurrency markets. Then, I placed the forged digital signatures he had planted to frame me. Finally, I laid down the Internet protocol logs proving he had orchestrated the entire theft from his own living room. It was a flawless, airtight federal case. It was a masterpiece of self-destruction. Once the documents were perfectly organized, I placed them into a thick, heavy-duty manila envelope. It felt incredibly substantial in my hands. It was the physical manifestation of my son's impending ruin. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had already opened a quiet inquiry into the pension anomaly through the Department of Labor. They knew the money was missing. They just did not know exactly who took it or how. I was about to hand them the entire puzzle completely solved and tied with a bow, but I needed to ensure this package went directly into the hands of the lead investigator, bypassing the standard bureaucratic delays and mail screening rooms. Victor Y said, looking over at the private investigator, "Do you have a direct conduit to the federal field office downtown?" Victor nodded slowly. "I have a contact on the inside, a desk sergeant who owes me a very significant favor. I can have this envelope placed directly onto the desk of Special Agent Thomas Vance. He is the lead forensic accountant assigned to the Caldwell logistics audit. If I put this in his hands tonight, he will have his entire team verifying the data by tomorrow morning. They will secure the arrest warrants before noon." I walked over to the desk and pulled a piece of heavy cream-colored stationery from my bag. It was my personal executive letterhead, the one I had used for decades to write thank you notes to loyal employees and holiday greetings to major clients. It felt strange to hold it now in this cheap motel room, knowing what I was about to use it for. I pulled out my gold fountain pen, the same pen I had used to sign the Golden Share activation documents just hours earlier. The federal agents needed context. They needed a map to find their target. I uncapped the pen and began to write. My hand did not shake. My breathing was completely steady. I pressed the nib against the heavy paper and wrote a single devastating paragraph in my sharp, distinct handwriting. To Special Agent Vance. Enclosed is the complete unredacted financial ledger of the Caldwell Logistics Employee Pension Fund. You will find the exact routing numbers, the offshore shell accounts, and the digital forensic proof of the $18 million embezzlement you are currently investigating. The digital signatures framing Richard Caldwell were forged. The Internet protocol logs attached will prove the transfers originated from the personal residence of the current acting executive. The man you are looking for will be announcing his new position as Chief Executive Officer at the Drake Hotel Corporate Gala this Friday night at exactly 8 o'clock. The media will be present. The entire board of directors will be present. Bring handcuffs. I read the note over one final time. It was perfect. It was cold, precise, and absolutely lethal. I folded the heavy cream paper and slid it into the manila envelope, resting it directly on top of the mountain of incriminating evidence. I peeled the adhesive strip and pressed the flap closed, running my thumb firmly along the edge to seal it tight. It was done. The trap was completely set. I handed the heavy package to Victor. "Deliver it immediately," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tell your contact that if Agent Vance wants to make the biggest federal bust of his career, he needs to read that file tonight." Victor took the envelope, feeling its immense weight. He placed it carefully into his leather briefcase and snapped the locks shut. He gave me a single grim nod. "The wolves are going to eat very well this week, Richard," he said quietly. He turned and walked out of the motel room, stepping back into the freezing Chicago rain. Sarah Jenkins stood near the doorway watching Victor leave. She looked at me, a profound mixture of relief and sorrow in her eyes. "It is really happening," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "He is going to prison." I turned to look at her. "Yes, Sarah, he is. And you are going to go back to the office right now. You are going to sit at your desk, and you are going to pretend everything is perfectly normal. You will go to the gala on Friday night. You will applaud when he takes the stage. You will not give him a single reason to suspect that the ground beneath his feet has completely vanished." Sarah nodded slowly, gathering her coat and her empty briefcase. "Thank you, Richard," she said softly, "for believing me, for not letting him destroy us all." She slipped out the door, disappearing into the gray afternoon. I was completely alone again in the dim motel room. The rain outside was beginning to turn into heavy snow, blanketing the industrial district in a thick layer of white. I walked over to the small, cracked mirror hanging above the cheap plastic sink. I looked at the man staring back at me. He looked older, tired, and deeply weathered, but his eyes were clear. The terrible, suffocating fog of the last 12 months had been completely burned away. My son had tried to bury me in the dark. He had tried to strip away my dignity, my legacy, and my freedom. He thought I was a weak, broken old man who would simply fade away without a fight. But he had forgotten the most important lesson I had ever tried to teach him. You do not survive 40 years in the Chicago logistics industry by being weak. You survive by being smarter, colder, and absolutely relentless when someone tries to take what is yours. The evidence was in the hands of the federal government. The golden share was fully activated. The legal guillotine was raised high into the air. All that was left to do was put on my best tuxedo walk into the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel and let the blade fall. Friday evening arrived in Chicago with a bitter, howling wind blowing violently off Lake Michigan, rattling the street lamps and freezing the city streets. But inside the grand ballroom of the historic Drake Hotel, it was a world of absolute, untouchable warmth and staggering privilege. The air in the massive hall was thick with the scent of expensive French perfume, roasted prime rib, and hundreds of blooming white lilies arranged in towering crystal vases. I stood in the shadowed, velvet-lined antechamber just outside the heavy mahogany doors of the main hall. Victor Rossi and Benjamin Pierce flanked me on either side, completely silent. Victor held a small digital receiver in his gloved hand, feeding the live, crystal-clear audio from the ballroom directly into a discreet earpiece I wore in my right ear. We were invisible ghosts waiting on the threshold of a kingdom that had been stolen from me. Through a narrow crack in the towering mahogany doors, I could see the sheer, breathtaking excess of the event unfolding before my eyes. Derek had spared absolutely no expense. Why would he? He was paying for every single drop of champagne and every single ounce of caviar with the stolen futures of my drivers, my mechanics, and my warehouse workers. There were towering, hand-carved ice sculptures placed at every corner of the room, reflecting the dazzling light of the massive antique crystal chandeliers hanging from the gold leaf ceiling. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos drifted silently through the crowd, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with imported delicacies. The elite of Chicago high society, the wealthy socialites, the powerful politicians, and the ruthless corporate titans were all gathered together, laughing and drinking, completely oblivious to the fact that they were dancing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. I watched Natalie holding court near the center of the room. She was wearing a stunning custom-tailored black silk gown that dragged elegantly across the polished marble floor. Around her neck, sparkling brilliantly under the chandeliers, was the heavy diamond collar I had purchased for Martha on our 30th wedding anniversary. She had not even bothered to alter the clasp. Natalie was smiling radiantly, laughing loudly at the jokes of the senior board members, acting as the perfect, gracious hostess. She looked like a young queen who had finally inherited her rightful, long-awaited throne. Off to the side, standing quietly near a towering pillar of white flowers, I saw Sarah Jenkins. She was dressed in a conservative, understated evening gown, holding a glass of sparkling water tightly in her hands. She looked incredibly pale, but she was playing her part flawlessly. She nodded politely when spoken to, giving Derek and Natalie the absolute comforting illusion of total compliance. The tension in the shadowed antechamber was absolutely suffocating. Benjamin checked his heavy gold pocket watch, the metallic click sounding incredibly loud in the silence. It was nearing 8 o'clock. The federal agents were already inside the building. I knew they were. Victor had confirmed just moments ago that plainclothes officers from the Federal Bureau of Investigation had quietly secured all the service elevators, the kitchen corridors, and the emergency fire exits. Special Agent Vance was not a man who missed a scheduled appointment, especially not when he was handed the largest financial bust of his career on a silver platter. But the agents were waiting in the perimeter. They were waiting for my specific signal. I wanted Derek to reach the absolute dizzying pinnacle of his arrogance before the floor completely gave out beneath him. I wanted him to feel the exact height of the cliff before he fell. Inside the grand ballroom, a soft melodic chime echoed through the sophisticated sound system, politely asking the hundreds of guests to take their respective seats. The low buzzing murmur of conversation slowly faded out as the wealthy attendees moved toward the massive circular dining tables covered in fine white linen and silver centerpieces. The house lights dimmed to a warm, intimate glow, leaving the dining floor in shadows, while a single brilliant white spotlight illuminated the grand stage at the far end of the room. The room grew completely quiet, waiting for the guest of honor. Derek walked out from behind the heavy velvet curtains. He was wearing a flawlessly tailored midnight blue tuxedo with a crisp white bow tie. His hair was perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place. He looked incredibly handsome, powerful, and entirely in control of his universe. The audience broke into a polite, sustained wave of applause as he stepped up to the clear acrylic podium. He adjusted the microphone with a confident, practiced hand, looking out over the sea of wealthy, powerful faces staring back at him. He smiled. It was a humble, practiced, utterly fabricated expression that I had seen him rehearse in the bathroom mirror when he was just a teenager preparing for a high school debate tournament. "Thank you," Derek began, his voice projecting smoothly and warmly through the massive room, carrying a perfectly calibrated tone of gentle, sorrowful authority. "Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. As I look out at this incredible gathering of friends, colleagues, and esteemed partners, I am filled with a profound sense of gratitude. And if I am being completely honest with all of you, a very deep, lingering sense of personal sorrow." He paused perfectly on cue, looking down at his hands, resting on the edges of the podium. He took a slow, heavy, theatrical breath, letting a deafening, sympathetic silence fill the grand ballroom. The performance was sickeningly brilliant. He was playing the emotions of the entire room like a master musician playing a grand piano. "As many of you know," Derek continued, his voice cracking ever so slightly, with perfectly faked emotion, "this company, Caldwell Logistics, was built by the sheer will of one man. My father, Richard Caldwell." The room murmured in soft, respectful agreement. He poured his absolute soul into this empire. He sacrificed his days and his nights, working through freezing winters and grueling summers to build the supply chain that we all rely on today. But the human mind is a deeply fragile thing. When my beloved mother, Martha, passed away last year, a light went out inside of my father. A vital, brilliant light that tragically could never be reignited. I listened to his poisonous lies through the earpiece, standing motionless in the dark hallway. My heart did not race. My blood was completely ice cold. Hearing him use Martha's name to justify his monstrous theft filled me with a rage so pure it felt like absolute clarity. I watched through the crack in the doors as he lifted a finger to wipe a single imaginary tear from the corner of his eye. Over the past 6 months, we watched him rapidly decline. Derek said, his voice dropping to a somber, intimate whisper that echoed clearly through the silent room. "It was the absolute hardest thing I have ever had to witness in my entire life." The dementia moved so aggressively. The paranoia, the confusion, the terrible self-destructive financial decisions he began making. He was becoming a profound danger to himself, and he was becoming a danger to the legacy he spent his entire life building. We had absolutely no choice but to step in. As a son, it completely broke my heart to take the keys away from the man who taught me how to drive. He looked out at the board of directors sitting at the front tables, offering them a solemn, reassuring nod. "But I want to assure all of you tonight, my father is safe. He is resting peacefully in a highly specialized private medical facility. He is receiving the absolute best psychiatric care available far away from the crushing, daily stress of the corporate world. He is finally at peace. And it is my sworn, sacred duty to ensure that his legacy survives his tragic illness." Derek stood a little taller, his chest expanding, as he shifted the narrative from a tragic, fabricated past to a glorious, stolen future. He raised his chin, his eyes shining with absolute, unchecked ambition and staggering greed. "The heavy burden of leadership has formally fallen to me," he proclaimed, his voice suddenly echoing with vibrant, triumphant energy. "But I am not standing up here alone. I am standing here with the greatest executive team in the entire logistics industry. We are closing the chapter on the old stagnant ways of doing business. We are modernizing our fleet. We are expanding our global reach. We are taking Caldwell Logistics into a completely new, unprecedented stratosphere of global commerce." A waiter in a white tuxedo walked quickly up to the stage and handed Derek a tall crystal flute filled with the most expensive vintage champagne on the market. Derek took the delicate glass and held it high into the air. The bright white spotlight caught the golden liquid, and the rising bubbles making the glass shine like a beacon of his absolute undeniable triumph. Across the massive, opulent ballroom, hundreds of guests stood up from their chairs, raising their own crystal glasses in unison. The sound of rustling silk, shifting chairs, and murmured agreements echoed through the grand room. I looked at Victor standing in the shadows beside me. He reached into his coat and rested his hand on his communication radio, giving me a single, slow nod. I looked at Benjamin. He adjusted his silk tie, his face set in a hard, unyielding mask of absolute legal fury. The time had finally come. The elaborate trap was fully sprung. The wolves were hungry and waiting at the gates. "To the future," Derek called out, his voice ringing with pure, unadulterated victory as he looked out over his stolen kingdom. "To absolute freedom. To the glorious new era of the Caldwell Empire." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Glasses clinked together in a massive, sweeping wave of ringing crystal. It was the highest, most glorious moment of my son's entire life. It was the exact moment I had been waiting for. I placed my hands flat against the polished brass handles of the towering mahogany doors. The muffled sound of thunderous applause and clinking crystal vibrated through the thick wood, a sickening symphony of my son's unearned victory. I took one final slow breath, letting the icy air of the antechamber completely fill my lungs. I pushed the doors open. They did not creak. They swung inward with a heavy, forceful weight, slamming against the interior walls of the ballroom with a sound like a thunderclap. The sudden noise cut violently through the cheerful din of the crowd. At first, only the people standing nearest to the entrance turned to look. But panic is a highly contagious disease. The laughter nearest to the doors abruptly died, replaced by sharp gasps of absolute shock. The silence spread inward from the perimeter of the room like a wave of freezing water, extinguishing the applause row by row, table by table, until the massive, opulent ballroom was plunged into a dead, suffocating quiet. The only sound left in the entire room was the soft, melodic classical music still playing from the string quartet in the corner, though even they slowly stopped playing as they noticed the terror spreading across the floor. I stepped over the threshold and walked into the glaring light of the chandeliers. I was not wearing the heavy wool coat or the cheap clothing of a transient ghost. I was wearing a flawlessly tailored charcoal gray Italian suit. My posture was perfectly straight. My chin was high. I looked exactly like the man who had built a shipping empire from the ground up, possessing an aura of absolute terrifying authority. Victor Rossi walked a half-step behind my right shoulder, his face a grim, unreadable mask of professional menace. Benjamin Pierce walked a half-step behind my left, holding his leather legal portfolio, like an executioner carrying a heavy blade. The sea of wealthy elites, board members, and politicians physically parted before me. They stepped back, their faces pale, pulling their expensive gowns and tailored tuxedos out of my path, as if I were a walking plague. They had just spent the last 20 minutes listening to a tearful eulogy about my broken mind. They believed I was heavily sedated, locked away in a padded cell thousands of miles across the ocean. Seeing me walking toward the grand stage exuding pure, unadulterated strength completely shattered their reality. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the stage. I did not look at the board members. I did not acknowledge the whispers. I only watched my son. Derek was standing frozen behind the clear acrylic podium. The triumphant, arrogant smile had been violently erased from his face, replaced by a look of profound, primal terror. The blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a polished wax figure melting under the stage lights. He gripped the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He looked like a man staring directly into the eyes of his own impending death. Down on the main floor, standing just a few feet away from the stage stairs, Natalie reacted. The smug, radiant queen of the Caldwell Empire stared at me with wide, horrified eyes. Her hand began to tremble uncontrollably. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her flawless fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, violent crack, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. The vintage champagne pooled around the hem of her expensive black silk dress. Her hand flew to her neck, instinctively clutching the diamond tennis bracelet she had stolen from my dead wife. I reached the base of the stairs and began to ascend. Each step of my leather shoes against the wooden risers sounded incredibly loud. I walked up to the center of the stage, stopping just 3 feet away from my son. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps. The confident, ruthless corporate titan had completely vanished, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, cowardly boy caught in a trap he could not possibly comprehend. "Dad." Derek stammered, his voice thin, reedy, and completely devoid of power. The microphone picked up his trembling whisper, broadcasting it to the hundreds of silent guests. You are supposed to be in treatment. The doctors said you were not well." I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply reached out and took the microphone from his shaking hand. I turned slightly to face the massive crowd of stunned elites, but my words were meant entirely for the traitor standing beside me. "I have never been sharper, Derek," I said smoothly, my voice projecting across the grand ballroom with a cold, devastating clarity. My mind is perfectly sound. In fact, it was legally certified as flawless just yesterday afternoon by the chief of forensic psychiatry at the Federal Medical Board. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out the heavy parchment document bearing the gold seal. I held it up for the front rows to see, then calmly dropped it onto the acrylic podium right in front of Derek. The paper landed with a soft, final thud. "That is a certificate of absolute mental competency," I explained, looking directly into my son's terrified, watering eyes. "It immediately and permanently invalidates the forged, purchased psychiatric evaluation you filed him on with the county clerk, which means the medical power of attorney you used to seize my life is completely void. You are no longer my medical guardian, Derek, and you are most certainly no longer the chief executive officer of this company." A wave of shocked murmurs erupted from the board of directors sitting at the front tables. The senior executives looked at each other in absolute bewilderment, realizing the entire foundation of Derek's leadership was a massive, illegal lie. Derek took a clumsy step backward, bumping into the floral arrangement behind him. "Dad, please," he begged softly, completely abandoning the microphone. "Let us go to the back room. We can talk about this. You are confused. You do not understand the corporate restructuring." "I understand absolutely everything," I replied, stepping closer to him, closing the distance until he had nowhere left to run. "I understand the blind trust you created. I understand the one-way ticket you bought for me on a rusted cargo freighter bound for an offshore asylum. I know you planned to let me die in the dark so you could parade around this ballroom wearing a tuxedo you bought with my money. I turned back to the microphone, addressing the entire room. The time for family secrets was completely over. I was going to burn his reputation to the ground in front of the exact people he wanted to impress. My son did not attempt to lock me away because I was grieving. I announced, my voice cutting through the rising panic in the room like a surgical scalpel. He did not do it out of love. He did it because he is a thief. He is an arrogant, deeply incompetent thief who gambled with the lives of thousands of hardworking families to cover his own catastrophic failures. I gestured toward Benjamin Pierce, who stepped forward and opened his heavy leather portfolio. He pulled out the formal notarized documents activating the failsafe. 40 years ago, I built a specific clause into the foundational charter of Caldwell Logistics. I declared, looking directly at the senior board members. The golden share. It grants the original founder supreme unilateral veto power over the entire corporation in the event of verifiable financial fraud. As of 5 o'clock this evening, that clause has been legally activated. The board is suspended. Every single executive bank account is frozen. The corporate credit cards currently sitting in my son's wallet are completely useless. Derek let out a choked, desperate sob. The reality of his absolute ruin was finally crushing the breath out of his lungs. "You cannot do this," he cried, tears spilling over his cheeks, ruining his perfectly groomed facade. "You are destroying the company. You are destroying me." "I did not destroy anything, Derek," I said, turning back to him, my eyes devoid of any fatherly warmth. "You destroyed yourself." I activated the golden share because my mind has never been sharper, especially when I was reading the real unredacted audit of the Employee Pension Fund. The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. The board members at the front tables physically recoiled. Sarah Jenkins stood near her pillar, watching the absolute destruction of the monster who had terrorized her, a look of profound relief washing over her face. "I know about the $18 million. Derek, I continued, my voice relentless, hammering the final nails into his coffin. "I know about the massive, unregulated offshore cryptocurrency accounts. I know about the failed commercial real estate flips in Dubai. And I know you drained the retirement savings of my drivers and my warehouse workers to cover your own massive debts." "No," Derek whimpered, shaking his head violently, looking frantically out at the crowd as if hoping anyone would come to his rescue. "That is a lie. That was an accounting error. I can fix it. I was going to put the money back." "You were never going to put the money back," I stated coldly, "because you knew the federal auditors had already found the missing capital. You knew the Department of Labor was preparing a massive federal indictment. That is why you forged my digital signatures on the transfer logs. That is why you planted my internet protocol addresses in the shadow ledgers. You tried to frame your grieving, supposedly demented father for your own federal crimes. You were perfectly willing to let me spend the rest of my life rotting in a Bahamian psychiatric prison just so you could avoid standing in a federal courtroom." The silence in the ballroom was absolute heavy and completely suffocating. The wealthy elite of Chicago were witnessing a public execution. Natalie was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, kneeling in the puddle of spilled champagne and broken crystal, realizing that her stolen kingdom had just turned to ash. "You are not a titan of industry, Derek," I whispered, stepping so close to him that only he and the microphone could hear my final judgment. "You are a coward, and your glorious new era is officially over." I turned away from my son, leaving him trembling and weeping behind the clear podium. I looked toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom. I gave a single subtle nod to Victor Rossi. The private investigator raised his radio to his mouth and spoke a single word. The trap was fully closed. The prey was completely broken. And it was time to let the wolves inside. Right on cue, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom did not just open. They were pushed aside with forceful, coordinated military precision. A dozen men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers over formal suits streamed into the grand hall. The letters FBI were printed in stark yellow across their backs. Special Agent Thomas Vance led the formation, holding a thick folder and a golden badge. He did not look at the terrified socialites. His eyes were locked entirely on the broken man standing behind the podium. The agents moved with terrifying efficiency, securing the perimeter of the stage. The elite of Chicago backed away in absolute silence as the federal government invaded their sanctuary. Agent Vance walked up the stage stairs. His boots echoed loudly against the wood. Derek did not run. He was completely paralyzed by the crushing reality of his own destruction. Agent Vance stopped right in front of him. Derek Caldwell Vance announced, his voice carrying undeniable federal authority. I am executing a warrant for your immediate arrest. You are charged with 18 counts of wire fraud, grand embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy to defraud the Employee Pension Fund. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked exactly like a suffocating fish, desperately gasping for air on a dry wooden deck. Two heavily armed federal agents quickly stepped up right behind him, grabbed his trembling arms, and pulled them firmly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the silent ballroom. It was the sound of his glorious era coming to a permanent end. Down on the main floor, another pair of agents approached Natalie. She was still kneeling in the puddle of spilled champagne. When the lead agent reached out to pull her to her feet, the illusion of her perfect marriage shattered. She did not stand by her husband. She turned into a cornered, desperate animal. "Do not touch me," she screamed, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of elegance. "I did not do anything. It was all him. He forced me. I did not know where the money was coming from. Please, you have to believe me, he is a monster." Derek looked down at his wife, his face contorting in sheer agony. The woman he had stolen millions to impress was eagerly throwing him to the wolves to save her own skin. The utter betrayal in his eyes was pitiful to watch, but I felt absolutely no pity. I had completely emptied my heart of sympathy for him. Derek fell to his knees on the hard wooden stage. He ignored the agents pulling at his arms. He looked directly up at me, tears streaming down his face, his chest heaving with desperate sobs. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice broken and pathetic in front of the hundreds of silent onlookers. "Dad, you have to stop this. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. I will give it all back. I promise. Please do not let them take me away. We are family. You are my father. I am your son. We are family, Dad." I looked down at the weeping, pathetic creature kneeling at my feet. I looked down at the boy whose Ivy League tuition I had paid with calloused hands. The boy who had smiled warmly at me while handing me an ivory envelope containing my own death sentence. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see if Richard Caldwell would finally break, waiting to see if a fatherly instinct would override the cold necessity of justice. I did not blink. I did not waver. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to his, ensuring my final words would be permanently burned into his memory. "Family does not hand you a one-way ticket to a madhouse, Derek," I said, my voice cold and hard as a diamond. "Enjoy your one-way ticket to federal prison." I slowly stood back up again, calmly straightening the cuffs of my tailored suit jacket, and permanently turned my back on him for the rest of my life. "Take him away right now, Special Agent Vance," I commanded quietly. The agents hauled my son to his feet and marched him down the stage stairs. They marched Natalie right behind him. The elite of Chicago watched in horrified silence as the newly crowned king and queen of Caldwell Logistics were paraded out in steel chains. The mahogany doors swung shut, leaving the room in a state of profound shock. I looked out at the terrified board of directors. "The grand gala is officially over," I announced smoothly. "I suggest you all go home. Monday morning we get back to work." The aftermath was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. Federal prosecutors did not offer Derek a plea deal. The evidence in that manila envelope was too overwhelming. The forensic logs and offshore routing numbers left his defense attorneys completely powerless. A federal judge sentenced my son to 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary. There would be no early parole. He was going to spend the best years of his life locked in a concrete cell, completely stripped of the luxury he had sacrificed his soul to obtain. Natalie did not fare much better. Despite her desperate attempts to turn state's evidence, accountants proved she was an active participant in laundering the stolen funds. She avoided prison, but the government seized absolutely everything. They took the massive multi-million-dollar house in Lincoln Park. They impounded her imported luxury cars, froze her private banking accounts, and confiscated the beautiful diamond tennis bracelet she had so proudly stolen from my dead wife. She was left entirely bankrupt, completely disgraced, and forced to return to the darkest shadows of the city with a permanently shattered reputation, knowing she had thrown away a life of absolute privilege for nothing. As for Caldwell Logistics, I used the supreme authority of the golden share to purge the rot from my empire. I unilaterally liquidated every personal asset Derek had acquired over the last 5 years. I sold his stock portfolios and real estate holdings, channeling every penny directly back into the employee pension fund. Within 3 weeks, the retirement accounts of my drivers and warehouse workers were restored to 100% capacity. They never lost a dime. The company needed a new, uncorrupted vision. I called Sarah Jenkins into my office. The terrified woman I had cornered was gone, replaced by a brilliant architect who risked everything to do the right thing. I promoted her. I named Sarah Jenkins the new chief executive officer, handing the keys of my empire over to someone who actually understood true loyalty. 6 months later, the freezing, biting winds of the Chicago Industrial District were a million miles away. I was standing on the private teakwood balcony of a true ultra-luxury cruise ship, looking out over the endless, glittering expanse of the Mediterranean Sea. The warm afternoon sun felt absolutely incredible against my skin. The gentle ocean breeze carried the sweet scent of salt and absolute freedom. There were no orderlies waiting for me at the next port. There was no corrupt offshore asylum waiting to swallow me into the dark. I had booked the grandest suite on the ship for exactly 3 months. I leaned against the polished mahogany railing, listening to the soothing, rhythmic sound of the waves breaking against the massive hull. I reached into the pocket of my linen trousers and pulled out a small silver object. It was Martha's antique pillbox. I ran my thumb over the delicate floral engravings, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of it in my hand. I did not feel the crushing, suffocating grief that had nearly destroyed me a year ago. I just felt a profound, quiet peace. I looked up at the endless blue sky, smiling softly to myself. I was finally taking our trip. It was a beautiful, hard-won victory. I had lost a son to the dark, insatiable hunger of greed. But I had saved my company. I had saved the futures of thousands of loyal families. And most importantly, I had saved my own soul. The ticket in my pocket was not a death sentence. It was a two-way ticket. And when the ship finally returned to port, I would walk down the gangway as a man completely unbroken, ready to live my remaining years in the brilliant light. If you listened to my story all the way to the end, thank you. Let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. If you believe that true karma always finds those who betray their own blood, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next life story. Until then, stay strong, trust your gut, and never let anyone tell you that you are entirely powerless. See you next time.